Imagine standing on a shoreline, not today, not a million years ago, not even 100 million years ago, but deep in the abyss of geological time. The air is thick, the waves lap gently against barren rocks, and the sun beats down on a world that feels profoundly, almost terrifyingly empty. There are no footprints in sand. There are no birds circling overhead. There is no rustle of leaves, because there are no trees, no shrubs, no grass. The land is completely dead. But if you look closely at the shallow waters, you'll see a green tint, a thick, slimy carpet stretching out as far as the eye can see. This is a microbial mat, and for 3 billion years, this was the pinnacle of life on Earth. If you were to stay on this beach and watch time speed by, thousands of years ticking past every second, you would fall asleep from the monotony. Eon after eon, nothing changes. The bacteria divide. The microbial mats breathe in sunlight and slowly exhale oxygen. The tides roll in and the tides roll out. The planet is alive, yes, but it is locked in a state of seemingly endless biological stasis. Life is just a planetary garden tended by microscopic beings, simple, blind, and profoundly unhurried. And then, suddenly everything breaks. In a geological instant, an eruption of biological creativity shatters the 3 billion-year silence. Without warning, the ocean floor begins to crawl. Bizarre, heavily armored creatures with compound eyes begin to hunt. Predators with grasping claws and circular, nightmare-inducing mouths patrol the waters. Spines, shells, teeth, and legs appear out of nowhere, within a window of just 20 million years, a duration that barely registers as a blink in the lifespan of planet. Virtually every major animal body plan that will ever exist bursts into existence. This is the event that kept Charles Darwin awake at night. This sudden, violent explosion of complexity seemed to violate his entire theory of slow, gradual evolution. Where were the intermediate steps? Where were the transitional forms? How did life go from motionless green slime to armored, hunting, seeing animals in what amounts to an evolutionary lightning strike? It is the greatest mystery in the fossil record, a biological Big Bang that set the stage for every fish, every dinosaur, every mammal, and every human that would ever live. Tonight on Earth's Documentary, we are rewinding the clock 541 million years to witness the moment life opened its eyes, bared its teeth, and decided to conquer the world. To truly grasp the sheer magnitude of this explosion, we first have to wander through the quiet, alien landscape of the world that came just before it. We must step into the Ediacaran period, a chapter of Earth's history spanning from 635 to 541 million years ago. This was the final stretch of the long, quiet era, but the oceans were no longer just filled with microscopic bacteria. Life had finally tried to get larger, but it did so following rules that have long since been erased from the cosmos. If you were to dive into an Ediacaran sea, you would feel like an astronaut exploring a distant exoplanet. The ocean floor is covered in those familiar, thick bacterial mats, but resting on top of them are things that defy common logic. You see flat, almost two-dimensional organisms that look like quilted air mattresses pressed into the mud. Some of them, like Dickinsonia, are the size of bath mats, oval and segmented, completely lacking a head, a tail, a mouth, or a gut. They just sit there, silently absorbing nutrients through their skin. A few feet away, you might see what looks like a beautiful, delicate fern swaying in the gentle water currents. But there are no plants here. This is Charnia, a fractal animal anchored to the seafloor, its body repeating the same branching pattern over and over again at smaller and smaller scales. These Ediacaran creatures are beautiful, strange, and entirely defenseless. This is a world without violence. It is a biological utopia, an era paleontologists sometimes called the Garden of Ediacara. There is no predation here. Nothing hunts. Nothing flees. There is no need for speed, so there are no fins or complex muscles. There is no need for armor, so there are no shells or bones. There is no need to detect danger, so there's not a single eye, ear, or brain on the entire planet. Life exists in a state of subtle, passive coexistence, slowly growing, feeding on the microbial mats, and reproducing in the quiet dark. For tens of millions of years, this pacifist kingdom thrives. If you were a time traveler observing this peaceful epic, you might assume this is the final form life would take. A tranquil, slow-moving garden covering the shallow seas. But beneath the surface, both chemically and geologically, a perfect storm is quietly assembling its pieces. The garden of Ediacara is doomed, and the agents of its destruction are invisible. The first ingredient of the coming revolution is oxygen. For billions of years, those monotonous microbial mats have been doing one thing remarkably well: photosynthesis. They have been drinking in sunlight and slowly releasing oxygen as a waste product. For a long time, the Earth simply swallowed this oxygen. It reacted with iron in the oceans, creating massive bands of rust that settled to the seafloor. But eventually, the ocean's appetite for oxygen was satisfied. The rust stopped forming, and the oxygen had nowhere to go but into water and up into the atmosphere. Slowly, inexorably, the oxygen levels are creeping upward. Why does this matter? Because complexity requires energy. If you are a flat, quilted Ediacaran organism that just sits still and absorbs food, you can survive on very low oxygen. But if you want to swim, if you want to flex powerful muscles, if you want to power a complex nervous system and process visual information, you need a high-octane fuel source. Aerobic metabolism, using oxygen to burn food for energy, is incredibly efficient. As the oxygen levels approach a critical threshold, crossing 15%, the invisible leash that has held life back is suddenly unclipped. The biological engine is finally flooded with fuel. But fuel isn't enough. You also need building materials. At the very same time the oxygen is rising, the continents themselves are shifting. The massive supercontinent of Rodinia is tearing itself apart. As the land mass is split, endless miles of new coastlines are formed. High tectonic activity and changing climate lead to massive weathering. Rain pounds the barren, rocky continents, washing unimaginable quantities of minerals directly into the shallow seas. The ocean is becoming a rich, chemical soup, and the concentration of one specific element is skyrocketing: calcium. The oceans are now saturated with calcium, roughly 3 times higher than they had been in the deep past. It is readily available, swirling all around these soft-bodied organisms. Life is now bathed in the exact raw material needed to build armor, waiting for the first organism to figure out how to use it. And right at the twilight of the Ediacaran period, around 550 million years ago, someone finally figures it out. If you look closely at the fossil record in these final, fading days of peace, you find something small, crude, but utterly revolutionary. It is a tiny, tube-shaped organism called Cloudina. It isn't much to look at, just a series of stacked, microscopic cones. But those cones are made of calcium carbonate. Cloudina has done the impossible. It has taken the dissolved minerals from the seawater and precipitated them into a hard, protective external skeleton. It is the very first shell, the invention of biomineralization. But why did Cloudina need a shell? In the Garden of Ediacara, there was no danger. The answer is found in the very rocks that hold Cloudina's fossilized remains. Some of these tiny stacked cones have perfectly round, microscopic holes bored directly through them. Someone was drilling into them. Someone was hunting them. The peace is breaking. The first predators have arrived. They are small, maybe just tiny worms with hardened mouth parts, but their mere existence shatters the 3 billion-year truce. For the first time in the history of planet Earth, one animal has looked at another and realized it is made of food. Suddenly, the ocean floor is no longer a safe place to just sit and absorb nutrients. You can see the panic written into the rocks. Trace fossils, the preserved marks of ancient behaviors, begin to change. For billions of years, the microbial mats were untouched. But now, you see squiggly lines cutting through them. Tiny, worm-like creatures are no longer grazing peacefully on the surface. They are digging. They are burrowing down into the mud, tearing through the microbial mats, desperately trying to hide from the new dangers lurking above. This is a Cambrian substrate revolution. By digging into the seafloor, these early burrowers are completely destroying the microbial mats that sustain the Ediacaran creatures. The flat, quilted giants like Dickinsonia, unable to move, unable to adapt, and their food source being literally churned into mud beneath them, slowly starve and vanish into extinction. The alien garden is being plowed under. The oxygen is high. The calcium is abundant. The old world has been cleared away, and the terrifying new concept of predation has been introduced. The match has been struck, and the powder keg of the Cambrian is ready to blow. When the smoke of that evolutionary explosion finally clears, we find ourselves in an ocean that is utterly unrecognizable. We have crossed the boundary. The year is 541 million years ago, and the quiet, static world of the Ediacaran is gone, buried beneath churning mud and a frantic, hyper-competitive new reality. The Cambrian period has begun. But to actually see this new world, to come face to face with the creatures that emerged from this biological Big Bang, we have to fast forward for just a moment to a late summer afternoon in the year 1909. Imagine riding on horseback high up into the freezing, thin air of the Canadian Rockies in British Columbia's Yoho National Park. An American paleontologist named Charles Doolittle Walcott is making his way down a treacherous mountain trail. At an elevation of over 7,000 feet, surrounded by jagged peaks and glaciers, his horse allegedly slips, dislodging a dark block of shale. Walcott climbs down, picks up the stone, and splits it open. Inside that rock, frozen in exquisite microscopic detail, is an alien creature. It is an animal with legs, gills, and a complex body, perfectly preserved in stone for over 500 million years. Walcott had just stumbled upon the Burgess Shale, one of the most important fossil discoveries in the entire history of human science. Over the next 14 years, fighting violent mountain storms and agonizingly short summer excavation seasons, Walcott and his team would blast and chisel their way into Fossil Ridge, extracting more than 65,000 specimens from the rock. What made the Burgess Shale so miraculous was not just the age of the fossils, but the way they died. During the middle of the Cambrian period, these animals have been living in a vibrant, shallow reef near the edge of a massive underwater cliff. Periodically, violent underwater mudslides, perhaps triggered by earthquakes or massive storms, would cascade down the shelf. These avalanches of fine mud would sweep up entire communities of Cambrian creatures, burying them instantly in the deep, dark, oxygen-starved abyss below. Because there was no oxygen, the bacteria that normally rot dead bodies couldn't survive. And because the mud was incredibly fine, it seeped into every crevice of the animals before slowly, over millions of years of immense pressure, turning into solid rock. The Burgess Shale didn't just preserve hard shells or bones. It preserved the unpreservable. It captured the soft tissues. Gills, digestive tracts, muscles, and eyeballs were replaced molecule by molecule with minerals. Looking at a Burgess Shale fossil is like looking at a high-definition photograph from 500 million years ago. And what those photographs revealed was a world of monsters. The undisputed tyrant of the Burgess Shale, the great white shark of the Cambrian seas, was a creature named Anomalocaris. Its name translates to abnormal shrimp. But that moniker does not do justice to the terror it must have inspired in its ecosystem. Imagine a predator up to 3 feet long, an absolute leviathan in a world where most animals were the size of your thumb. Anomalocaris propelled itself through the water, using a series of overlapping flaps running down the sides of its body, moving with an eerie, undulating grace. But it is the front of the animal that reveals the true brutality of the Cambrian arms race. Anomalocaris possessed 2 massive, segmented, heavily spiked appendages curling out from its face, designed to snap shut and impale fleeing prey. Beneath its head was a mouth unlike anything alive today, a terrifying, circular arrangement of overlapping, razor-sharp plates that open and close like the mechanical iris of a camera lens. It was a mouth built for crushing the shells of the newly armored animals crawling on the seafloor. And watching over this entire apparatus were 2 enormous, stalked compound eyes, giving the predator an unprecedented field of vision. Anomalocaris wasn't just fumbling in the dark. It was actively tracking, pursuing, and calculating its attacks. The discovery of Anomalocaris shocked the scientific community. It took decades for paleontologists to even realize it was a single animal. Initially, its grasping claws were classified as a type of weird shrimp. Its circular, toothy mouth was thought to be a fossilized jellyfish. Its body was identified as a sea cucumber. It wasn't until scientists found complete, perfectly preserved specimen that they realized all 3 of these bizarre fossils were actually just the disassembled parts of one massive, highly specialized killing machine. But Anomalocaris was only the beginning. The Burgess Shale was a carnival of evolutionary experimentation, filled with creatures so profoundly strange that paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould famously dubbed them the Weird Wonders. Take Opabinia, for example. When a reconstruction of Opabinia was first unveiled at a paleontology conference in 1972, the audience of distinguished scientists literally burst into laughter. They thought it was a joke. It looked like a creature stitched together from a science fiction nightmare. Opabinia had 5 separate eyes perched on stalks atop its head, scanning the water in almost 360 degrees. And extending from beneath those 5 eyes was a long, flexible, muscular hose, a proboscis, tipped with a pair of grasping, spiked jaws. It likely swam just above the mud, using its bizarre facial trunk to snatch soft body worms hiding in the sediment. Then there was Hallucigenia, a creature whose name perfectly describes the feeling of looking at it. For years, scientists couldn't even figure out which way was up. It was a tiny, worm-like animal. On one side, it had 7 pairs of stiff, needle-like spines. On the other side, it had 7 pairs of long, flexible tentacles. For a long time, researchers thought it walked on the stiff spines like a pair of biological stilts, waving the soft tentacles in the water to catch food. We now know it was the other way around. It walked on the tentacles, which were actually soft legs tipped with tiny claws, and the massive spines pointed upward, a bristling fortress of armor designed to choke any predator foolish enough to try and swallow it. Everywhere you looked in the Burgess Shale, evolution was throwing things at the wall to see what would stick. Wewaxia crawled along the bottom, a creature resembling a cross between a slug and a heavily armored pine cone, covered in overlapping scales and flanked by 2 rows of skyward-pointing daggers. Marella, a delicate lace-like arthropod with backward-sweeping head shields, swam in massive schools, filtering particles from the water. This was a mature, deeply complex ecosystem. There were apex predators, mid-level scavengers, bottom-feeding grazers, and filter feeders. It was a world divided into hunters and the hunted, operating with a level of sophistication that rivaled modern coral reefs. But as breathtaking as the Burgess Shale was, it posed a new problem. These fossils were 58 million years old, placing them in the middle of the Cambrian period. By the time these animals were buried in their muddy graves, the explosion had already happened. The arms race was already in full swing. To see the actual fuse being lit, paleontologists needed to dig deeper. They needed to find rocks that were even older. And in 1984, on the other side of the planet, in the Yunnan province of southwestern China, they found exactly that. A Chinese paleontologist named Ho Xianguang was mapping rocks near the small town of Chengjiang when he split open a piece of yellow shale. Inside was a fossil, preserved with the exact same soft tissue perfection as the Canadian fossils. But these rocks were 520 million years old. They predated the Burgess Shale by more than 10 million years. Ho had found a window into the absolute earliest dawn of the Cambrian Explosion. The Chengjiang fossil beds changed everything. Because if the Burgess Shale proved that the Cambrian oceans were complex, Chengjiang proved that this complexity happened with a speed that defied logic. Here, right at the beginning of the period, barely 20 million years after the end of the Ediacaran peace, life had already conquered the art of survival, and the preservation at Chengjiang was incredibly even better than in Canada. The mud that buried these creatures was so perfectly fine that it didn't just preserve muscles and gills. It preserved ghosts of the mind. Using high-powered micro-CT scanners, researchers examining Chengjiang arthropods, like a creature named Fuxianhuia, found fossilized cardiovascular systems. They found preserved digestive tracts. And, most miraculously of all, they found the oldest fossilized brains in the history of the Earth. Traces of neural tissue, preserved in stone, showed a 3-part brain structure remarkably similar to modern insects. Think about what that means. In the Ediacaran period, there were no brains. Animals were basically reactive sacks of tissue. Just 20 million years later, the ocean is swimming with creatures possessing complex, partitioned nervous systems capable of processing dense streams of sensory information, making split-second decisions and coordinating intricate physical movements to hunt or escape. What could possibly drive such an insanely rapid leap in neurological complexity? What was the ultimate catalyst that forced the brain to evolve at warp speed? The answer is light. The answer is the invention of vision. Of all the weapons forged during the Cambrian Explosion, none fundamentally altered the trajectory of life on Earth more than the eye. Before the Cambrian, the ocean was a tactile, chemical world. Organisms bumped into things in the dark. They sensed changes in water pressure. They tasted dissolved molecules drifting in the currents. It was a game of blind man's bluff. If a predator was approaching, you wouldn't know it until its jaws were already closing around you. But then, somewhere in the murky depths of evolutionary time, a mutation occurred. A patch of cells on the surface of an organism became photosensitive. It could tell the difference between light and dark. It wasn't a true image yet, but even this crude awareness was a superpower. It could tell you if you were in the sun, where food grows, or in the shadow, where a predator might be looming. Over thousands of generations, natural selection rapidly refined this light-sensitive patch. It dipped into a cup shape, allowing the animal to determine the direction the light was coming from. The cup closed into a pinhole, focusing the light. And finally, a lens evolved, crystallizing the light into a sharp, high-definition image of the world. Suddenly, the lights in the ocean were turned on, and there was nowhere left to hide. The evolution of the eye triggered the most intense evolutionary arms race the planet has ever seen. Once a predator like Anomalocaris could see its prey from yards away, the soft, squishy, blind animals of the past were instantly obsolete. If you could be seen, you could be tracked. If you could be tracked, you could be eaten. The prey had to respond immediately or face total annihilation. The response was to armor up. The crude, microscopic shells of Cloudina at the end of the Ediacaran suddenly scaled up into an absolute obsession with biomineralization. The soft-bodied creatures of the ocean rapidly figured out how to extract dissolved calcium from the seawater and weave it into thick, impenetrable suits of armor. They grew spikes. They grew heavy plates. They built fortresses around their vital organs. And no creature mastered the art of armor warfare quite like the undeniable kings of the Cambrian, the trilobites. If Anomalocaris was the great terror of the Cambrian, the trilobite was its greatest success story. Appearing suddenly around 521 million years ago, these heavily armored, segmented creatures would go on to conquer the oceans and survive for a staggering 270 million years. They are the ultimate survivors of the deep past. The name trilobite comes from the three-lobe structure of their body, a raised central axis running down the middle, flanked by two flattened lobes on either side. From front to back, they were divided into a head shield, a flexible multi-segmented thorax, and a fused tail shield. They were the biological equivalent of a heavily armored tank, bristling with spikes and covered in a thick, rigid exoskeleton. But what made the trilobite truly magnificent was not its armor, but what it did with its eyes. Remember the calcium carbonate swirling in the Cambrian seas? The mineral that animals were using to build their shells? Trilobites took this mineral, a crystalline form of calcium carbonate called calcite, and they did something that seemed scientifically impossible. They used it to build their lenses. Trilobites literally saw the world through solid rock. Unlike humans who have soft protein-based lenses in our eyes, the trilobite grew crystals. Each eye was a compound structure, made up of hundreds and in some species, thousands of individual, perfectly shaped calcite crystals, all oriented in precise arrays to focus light down onto photoreceptor cells. It is one of the most elegant, astonishing solutions to vision in the history of biology. And they didn't just build crude lenses. Some advanced trilobite species developed doublet lenses, two different layers of crystal with different refractive indexes perfectly engineered to correct for spherical aberration, the blurring of light around the edges of a lens. Humans wouldn't discover the mathematics of correcting spherical aberration until the brilliant physicists René Descartes and Christian Huygens figured it out in the 17th century. The trilobite had mastered the physics of optics using rocks in its face 400 million years earlier. With their stone eyes locked onto their surroundings, trilobites scurried across the seafloor, dominating the ecology of the planet. Some were tiny, blind scavengers sifting through the mud. Others were giant, spiny predators with massive eyes wrapping around their heads, giving them 360-degree vision. When threatened by an Anomalocaris swooping down from above, a trilobite could perform a neat evolutionary trick. It could enroll, using its flexible thorax. It would curl into a tight, impregnable ball, tucking its soft legs inside and exposing nothing but a dome of spiked, solid rock to the frustrated predator. Because their armor was so rigid, trilobites couldn't grow inside it. To get bigger, they had to periodically shed their entire exoskeleton, crawling out the back of their old shell, soft and vulnerable, waiting for their new, larger armor to harden. Because a single trilobite could molt dozens of times in its life, it left behind dozens of perfect, empty suits of armor on the seafloor. This is why trilobite fossils are so incredibly abundant today. We're often not finding their dead bodies. We are finding their discarded clothes. This was a harsh, unforgiving reality of the Cambrian Explosion. The peace of Ediacaran was a distant memory. In this new world, you either evolved vision, armor, speed, or weapons, or you were erased in the timeline. The oceans became a bloody, beautiful, high-stakes theater of survival. Filter feeders clung to the rocks, pumping water through their bodies while trying to avoid the crushing jaws of newly evolved mollusks. Brachiopods, looking like simple clams but operating with complex internal organs, built shells of calcium phosphate and anchored themselves in the currents. Worms evolved terrifying, ever-visible jaws that could shoot out of their throats to grab passing prey. Every single creature was locked in an endless feedback loop of escalation. The predator evolves a better eye, so the prey evolves a thicker shell. The prey evolves a thicker shell, so the predator evolves a stronger crushing claw. The predator gets a stronger claw, so the prey evolves the ability to burrow faster. It was an engine of infinite creativity, fueled by the sheer terror of being eaten. But amidst this clash of titans, amidst the armored tanks of the sea floor and the massive alien predators patrolling the waters above, there was another group of animals quietly swimming in the background. They didn't have heavy armor. They didn't have massive, spike-covered grasping appendages. They were tiny, soft, and completely unimpressive to look at. But hidden inside their small, undulating bodies was a totally new architectural blueprint, a secret weapon of design that would eventually allow them to leave the oceans entirely, to conquer the land, to take to the skies, and eventually to look up at the stars and wonder where they came from. Among the glittering, sharp-edged monsters of the Cambrian seas, the heavily armored trilobites, and the terrifying, grasping claws of the apex predators, there lived a creature so seemingly insignificant that for decades, paleontologists completely overlooked its importance. If you were swimming through the warm, shallow waters of the Burgess Shale 500 million years ago, you probably wouldn't even notice it. It was called Pikaia. It was barely 2 inches long, lacking the heavy calcite armor of its neighbors. It had no fearsome jaws, no massive compound eyes on stalks, and no spiky appendages. It looked, for all intents and purposes, like a flattened, translucent worm, or perhaps a tiny, featureless eel, undulating weakly in the shadows of the great Cambrian reefs. To a time-traveling observer, Pikaia would look like prey, a bottom feeder destined to be forgotten. But hidden beneath its soft, unprotected skin was a structural revolution that would change the course of planetary history. Running straight down the back of this tiny, swimming ribbon was a stiff, flexible rod of tightly packed cells. This was the notochord, and directly above this notochord, running parallel to it, was a hollow nerve cord. Pikaia was not a worm. It was a chordate. It was a member of the exact same evolutionary family tree that, hundreds of millions of years later, would produce the great white shark, the Tyrannosaurus rex, the golden eagle, and you. To understand why this simple, flexible rod was such a devastatingly effective secret weapon, you have to look at the reigning champions of the Cambrian, the arthropods. Animals like the trilobite had achieved massive success by building their skeletons on the outside. An exoskeleton is brilliant for defense. It is a biological suit of armor, but it comes with a fatal flaw. It is a prison. A rigid shell cannot grow. For an arthropod to get larger, it must go through the agonizing, dangerous process of molting, shedding its armor and waiting in terrified vulnerability for a new, larger shell to harden. This severely limits how big an animal can efficiently become, and it limits how they move. The notochord of Pikaia and the early chordates like it turned this entire engineering paradigm inside out. Instead of skeleton on the outside, they built a scaffold on the inside. This internal rod gave their muscles something firm to pull against, allowing them to swim with a smooth, continuous, S-shaped undulation that was far more energy efficient than the jerky, mechanical paddling of the arthropods. But more importantly, an internal skeleton grows with the animal. It doesn't need to be shed. It can support enormous weight. It can be scaled up almost infinitely. While Pikaia was making its quiet living in the Canadian seas, an even more advanced chordate was swimming in the older Xinjiang fossil beds of China. Its name was Heikuichthys. It was about the size of a paperclip, but it had taken the basic chordate blueprint and refined it. Heikuichthys had distinct, V-shaped blocks of muscle running down its sides, identical to the muscle flakes you see when you cook a piece of salmon today. It had feathery gills for extracting oxygen, and, most miraculously of all, the nerve core at the very front of its body had begun to swell, housing a primitive brain, and it was protected by a very early, rudimentary framework of cartilage. It was the absolute dawn of the skull, the birth of the vertebrate lineage. These tiny, soft-bodied swimmers were not the masters of Cambrian. They spent their lives hiding from the true terrors of the deep, but they carried within them a biological architecture so profound, so infinitely adaptable, that it would eventually conquer the earth. Every bone in your body, the spine that holds you upright, the skull that houses your consciousness, the jaw you use to speak, all of it traces its deep evolutionary roots back to the anatomical gambles made by these tiny, unassuming creatures swimming through a sea of monsters. But to truly understand how these creatures and all the bizarre wonders of the Cambrian Explosion managed to evolve at such blinding speed, we have to pull back. We have to zoom out from the microscopic genetics and the individual fossils and look at the Earth from space, because the stage upon which this drama was unfolding was unlike anything we would recognize today. If you were to view the Earth from orbit 541 million years ago, the first thing you would notice is the color. There is no green on the land, not a single blade of grass, not a patch of moss, not a forest or jungle. The continents are completely barren expanses of gray, brown, and red rock, blasted by wind and rain. The entirety of the planet's life is confined to the water, and the map of those continents is completely alien. The Earth's crust is in a state of rapid, violent rearrangement. The massive supercontinent that had dominated the Precambrian world, a vast unified landmass, had shattered. The pieces were drifting rapidly across the globe, pushed and pulled by the churning mantle deep beneath the crust. The largest of these shattered fragments was Gondwana, a colossal, lumbering giant of a continent that stretched from the equator all the way down to the South Pole. Gondwana contained the bedrock that would one day become South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, and India. Drifting completely separate from Gondwana were other massive islands of rock. There was Baltica, the ancient core of northern Europe. There was Siberia, an isolated continent floating on its own. And straddling the equator, basking in the tropical sun, was Laurentia, the ancient heart of what is now North America. This specific arrangement of the continents was the ultimate incubator for an evolutionary explosion. Because the continents were broken apart, there were thousands upon thousands of miles of new coastlines. And because there were no ice caps at the poles, the Earth was trapped in an intense greenhouse climate with carbon dioxide levels 10 to 20 times higher than they are today. Sea levels were astronomically high. The oceans didn't just stop at the edge of the continents. They spilled over them. Vast portions of these ancient landmasses were completely submerged under shallow, warm, tropical waters known as epicontinental seas. Imagine an ocean that covers half of North America, but it is never deeper than a few hundred feet. The water is crystal clear, heated by the intense greenhouse sun and constantly churned by warm equatorial currents. Furthermore, because the land was totally barren of plant life, there were no roots to hold the soil together. When it rained, massive rivers of mud, silt, and dissolved minerals washed straight off the bare rock and poured directly into these shallow seas. This created an absolute paradise for marine life. The shallow waters were flooded with sunlight, allowing plankton and algae to bloom in numbers never before seen. The runoff from the continents provided an endless buffet of calcium, phosphorus, and iron. It was a warm, brightly lit, nutrient-rich, shallow water laboratory, perfectly optimized for biological experimentation. But a perfect environment and a sudden influx of oxygen and calcium still don't fully explain the sheer, terrifying speed of the Cambrian Explosion. How do you get from a flat, brainless ediacaran to a highly complex, swimming, seeing, hunting arthropod in the blink of a geological eye? For a long time, Scientists assumed that to build a new, complex animal, evolution had to write entirely new genetic code from scratch. And writing new code through random mutation takes time. A lot of time. It wasn't until the late 20th century, with the rise of evolutionary developmental biology, often called evo-devo, that the final piece of the Cambrian puzzle clicked into place. The secret of the Cambrian explosion was not the invention of new genes. It was a discovery of how to use the genes that were already there. Deep inside the DNA of almost every animal on Earth, including you, there is a set of master control switches. They are called Hox genes. Think of Hox genes not as the blueprints that build a specific part of a body, but as the architects who direct the construction crew. Hox genes dictate the fundamental body plan of an animal along its head-to-tail axis. They tell the developing embryo, put the head here, put the antennae here, put the legs here, put the tail here. What scientists discovered to their absolute shock is that the Hox genes inside a modern fruit fly are virtually identical to the Hox genes inside a mouse, and virtually identical to the Hox genes inside a human. If you take the Hox gene that tells a fruit fly to grow an eye, and you insert it into the leg of a fruit fly embryo, it will grow a fly eye on its leg. But if you take the gene that tells a mouse to grow an eye, and you insert it into the fruit fly, the fly still grows a fly eye. The master switch is universal. It just triggers whatever local genetic material is available. This revelation solved the greatest mystery of the Cambrian explosion. The organisms of the late Ediacaran period, those simple, flat, brainless creatures, already possessed this complex genetic toolkit. The master switches had already evolved in the quiet dark of the pre-Cambrian. The code was written. It was just sitting there, dormant, waiting for a reason to be activated. When the environment finally changed, when the oxygen level spiked, when the calcium flooded the seas, and when the first predator took its first bite, life didn't have to wait millions of years to randomly mutate a leg, or an eye, or a shell. The genetic switches were simply flipped. A slight mutation in the timing or the placement of a Hox gene expression could instantly duplicate a body segment, giving an animal 4 legs instead of 2. Another slight tweak could turn a simple swimming appendage into a grasping claw. Another tweak could turn a light-sensitive spot into a compound eye. The Cambrian explosion wasn't life writing a new book from scratch. It was life frantically copy-pasting, editing, and remixing a manuscript that had been sitting on the shelf for 100 million years. Evolution suddenly had a modular toolkit. Animals could be built like biological Lego sets, mixing and matching segments, armor plates, and sensory organs. This is why the Burgess Shale is filled with such bizarre, chimera-like creatures. The weird wonders like Opabinia with its 5 eyes and vacuum hose mouth, or Hallucigenia with its stilt-like spines, were the result of life aggressively playing with these master control switches, testing every conceivable combination of body parts to see what would survive in the new, ruthless ecosystem. And as these diverse new body plans locked into place, the ocean's ecology underwent a transformation just as profound as the anatomical one. The two-dimensional world of the bacterial mat was gone forever. The ocean was now a fully realized, three-dimensional theater. At the very surface, microscopic phytoplankton bathed in the intense sunlight, turning solar energy into the base of the global food web. Just below them, massive swarms of zooplankton, including the larval stages of trilobites and bizarre, tiny crustaceans, graze on the algae. Through the middle of the water column swam the early chordates, darting away from the grasping tentacles of early jellyfish and the predatory strikes of swimming arthropods. Down on the seafloor, the reef systems were booming. But these weren't reefs made of modern coral. They were built by a now-extinct group of organisms called archaeocyathids. These creatures look like a cross between a sponge and a coral, building massive, intricate skeletons of calcium carbonate that piled up over generations, creating towering underwater cities. These reefs provided endless nooks and crannies for life to hide in, further accelerating the diversity of the ecosystem. Sponges pumped millions of gallons of water through their porous bodies, filtering out bacteria. Brachiopods snapped their shells shut at the shadow of a passing predator. Heavily armored trilobites plowed to the mud, their complex calcite eyes scanning the horizon, while deeply buried worms churned the sediment, oxygenating the sea floor and releasing trapped nutrients back into the water. And presiding over it all were the apex predators, the anomalocaridids, cruising the reefs with their alien, undulating flaps, their massive eyes locking onto movement, their circular jaws ready to crush the newly forged armor of their prey. But perhaps the most profound change to the Earth's ecosystem wasn't the predators, or the armor, or the eyes. It was something much less glamorous. With the evolution of complete one-way digestive tracts, a mouth at one end and an anus at the other, the Cambrian animals invented the fecal pellet. For billions of years, when single-celled organisms died, their organic matter just floated in the water column, slowly decomposing near the surface, consuming oxygen in the process. But when a massive Cambrian predator ate a meal, it packaged the waste into dense, heavy pellets. These pellets sank like stones into the deep, dark, oxygen-starved abyss of the ocean. This was the birth of the biological pump. Trillions of animals every single day were actively pulling carbon out of the surface waters and burying it in the deep ocean floor. This changed the chemistry of the entire planet. By burying the carbon, the Cambrian animals prevented it from reacting with the oxygen in the water. This allowed global oxygen levels to stabilize and climb even higher, creating a positive feedback loop that allowed animals to grow even larger, even faster, and even more complex. Life was no longer just a passenger on planet Earth. Life was now an active geological force, re-engineering the chemistry of the oceans and the composition of the atmosphere to suit its own explosive ambitions. The machine of complex ecology was fully assembled, humming with lethal, beautiful efficiency. The basic rules of the game that you and I still live by today, see or be seen, eat or be eaten, adapt or die, had been written into the stone. With the rules of the game written into stone, the oceans became a theater of high-stakes gambling. Evolution is not a conscious engineer. It is a blind, relentless tinkerer. It does not plan for the future, and it has no concept of progress. It only cares about what works right now, in this exact moment, to keep an organism alive long enough to pass on its genetic code. And in the hyper-competitive, sun-drenched shallow seas of the Middle Cambrian, life was placing some of the most bizarre and desperate bets in the history of the planet. This brings us to a beautiful, haunting concept that evolutionary biologists call contingency. If you could somehow rewind the tape of life, if you could go back to the dawn of the Cambrian Explosion, shuffle the environmental deck, and hit play once more, would the world look anything like it does today? Would there be birds? Would there be mammals? Would there be humans? Or would the Earth be dominated by the descendants of the five-eyed Opabinia, or the stilt-walking spiked hallucigenia? For a long time, the weird wonders of Cambrian were viewed as evolutionary failures, bizarre dead ends that were simply too strange to survive. But the truth is far more tragic and far more terrifying. These animals were not failures. They were absolute masters of their universe. They had been honed to perfection by millions of years of brutal natural selection. An animal like Anomalocaris was a flawless apex predator, perfectly designed to hunt in the warm, stable, shallow seas of its time. But perfection in biology is a trap. When you become perfectly adapted to one specific world, you become intensely vulnerable to the slightest change in that world. And the Earth is a restless, chaotic planet. The warm, greenhouse paradise of the Cambrian was not destined to last forever. As we move toward the late Cambrian, crossing the 500 million year mark, the golden age of the explosion begins to stutter. The planetary engine that had created the perfect evolutionary laboratory begins to shift gears. The first signs of trouble appear not in the form of a dramatic asteroid strike or a sudden volcanic apocalypse, but in the slow, silent draining of the seas. For tens of millions of years, the broken, drifting continents of Laurentia, Gondwana, and Baltica had been flooded by high oceans, creating those vast, shallow epicontinental marine nurseries. But now, the Earth's tectonic plates are shifting in ways that cause the ocean basins to subtly deepen and the land masses arise. The water begins to pull back. The endless miles of sunlit, shallow coastlines, the very incubators of the Cambrian Explosion, are slowly exposed to the open air and baked dry by the intense, UV-drenched sun. For the animals that had built their entire lives around these warm, shallow reefs, their world is literally shrinking beneath them. Competition, already fierce, becomes unimaginably brutal as populations are forced into smaller and smaller pockets of habitable water. But shrinking habitat was only the beginning of a nightmare. A far more insidious killer was rising from the deep. Remember the biological pump? The trillions of animals eating and excreting, packaging organic matter, and sending it down into the dark abyss? That process had successfully stabilized oxygen levels at the surface. But deep down at the bottom of the ocean, all of that decaying organic matter was feeding massive colonies of bacteria. And as those deep-sea bacteria feasted, they consumed oxygen. Vast, silent dead zones began to form in the deepest parts of the ocean, massive bodies of water completely devoid of oxygen, choked with toxic hydrogen sulfide. Normally, these dead zones stayed trapped in the abyss. But as the continent shifted and ocean currents changed, the deep, cold, toxic water was suddenly forced upward. It welled up from the darkness and spilled onto the continental shelves. This was an oceanic anoxic event, and it is one of the most terrifying phenomena in nature. Without warning, the warm, oxygen-rich waters of the Cambrian reefs were flooded with suffocating, toxic, oxygen-starved currents. The animals couldn't fight it. They couldn't outrun it. They simply couldn't breathe. The late Cambrian is punctuated by a series of these invisible, suffocating pulses. They weren't a single catastrophic wipeout like the one that would eventually claim the dinosaurs, but rather a slow, agonizing tightening of the noose. It was a series of extinction events that acted as a brutal biological sieve. The highly specialized animals, the ones that required perfect conditions to survive, were the first to die. The mighty reef-building archaeocyathids, whose towering underwater cities provided shelter for countless species, simply choked and vanished, leaving their ghostly, calcium carbonate skeletons to crumble in the toxic currents. The weird wonders, the highly adapted chimeras of the Burgess Shale, were largely erased from the timeline. Even the apex predators, the terrifying anomalocaridids that had ruled the oceans with unquestioned authority, found their populations decimated. When the food web collapses from the bottom up, the kings are the ones who starve. Even the undisputed champions of the Cambrian, the heavily armored trilobites, face an absolute massacre. Entire lineages, like the majestic, large-headed olanellids that had dominated the early Cambrian, were completely wiped out. The fossil record of the late Cambrian is littered with the shattered, dead remains of once thriving trilobite dynasties. By the time the calendar turns to 485 million years ago, marking the official end of the Cambrian period and the beginning of the Ordovician, the oceans have been profoundly humbled. Between 40 and 50% of all marine genera have been completely annihilated. The biological Big Bang is over, but life is nothing if not resilient. When the anoxic waters finally recede and the climate begins to stabilize once more, the survivors peek out from the mud and the rock crevices to behold an emptied world. The slate hasn't been wiped clean, but has been violently cleared of the old guard. And in the wake of this mass death, a new era of radiation begins. The Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event. If the Cambrian was the explosion of basic body plans, the Ordovician was the explosion of species. The animals that survived the Cambrian dying didn't invent entirely new ways of living. They took the blueprints forged in the Cambrian and elaborated on them to a staggering degree. The trilobites, though bruised and battered, orchestrate one of the greatest evolutionary comebacks in history. In the empty oceans of the Ordovician, they explode into an astonishing variety of forms. This is when they reach their absolute peak of diversity. More than 5,000 new species of trilobites emerge. They evolve long, sweeping spines to prevent themselves from sinking into soft mud. They evolve smooth, aerodynamic shells for swimming rapidly through the open water. And their eyes, those miraculous lenses made of solid rock, reach the pinnacle of their design. Ordovician trilobites evolved the schizochroal eye. Instead of thousands of tiny, packed lenses, these eyes feature fewer, but much larger, thicker lenses, each one separated by a thick wall of armor. These lenses are perfectly engineered doublets, completely correcting for underwater distortion. These trilobites possess some of the most acute, sophisticated vision of any animal on the planet, allowing them to spot predators from incredible distances in the increasingly dangerous Ordovician seas. Because the predators were getting smarter, and they were getting faster. While the trilobites were rebuilding their armored empires, the mollusks were staging a revolution of their own. The descendants of the tiny, shelled creatures of the Cambrian began to pump gas into their shells, allowing them to lift off the seafloor. These were the nautiloids, the ancient ancestors of today's squid and octopuses. By the middle of the Ordovician, some of these nautiloids would grow straight, cone-like shells reaching up to 30 feet long, propelling themselves through the water with terrifying speed using jet propulsion. The anomalocardids were gone, and the giant nautiloids had taken their throne. But hidden in the shadows of the giant squids and the armored trilobites, the true heirs to the planet were quietly, patiently biding their time. The tiny, swimming chordates, the descendants of Pikaia and Haecoichthys, had survived the Cambrian extinctions. They were still small, and they were still largely at the bottom of the food chain. But they had watched the trilobites survive by building armor on the outside, and they realized in the blind, brilliant logic of evolution that they could do the same thing but better. They took the dissolved calcium and phosphorus from the ocean, and they began to weave it not into an exoskeleton, but into their internal notochord. They began to mineralize their cartilage. They invented bone. These early vertebrates, known as ostracoderms, didn't have jaws yet. They couldn't bite. They fed by vacuuming up mud and filtering out organic particles. But they were covered from head to tail in heavy, bony plates. For the first time in history, our direct ancestors were armoring up for war. The internal skeleton that had allowed them to swim so efficiently was now becoming an indestructible internal fortress. The Cambrian Explosion had lit the fuse. The Ordovician was fanning the flames. The oceans were now a fully modern battlefield, teeming with complex, calculating, armored, and seeing animals. But the land, the vast, gray, silent continents of rock, still lay completely dead, waiting for the brave, desperate few who would eventually dare to leave the water behind. For hundreds of millions of years, the oceans of our planet have been an absolute cauldron of biological innovation, a ruthless arena of predators and prey locked in an endless, escalating war. But if you were to lift your head above the waves during the Silurian period, roughly 440 million years ago, the deafening silence of the surface world would be a profound shock. The continents are still here, drifting slowly across the globe, but they remain a desolate, alien wasteland. Vast expanses of jagged gray bedrock, sweeping deserts of blown sand, and endless, barren plains of crushed stone stretch from horizon to horizon. There is no soil. There is no dirt as we understand it, because dirt is a biological product, a mixture of crushed rock and the decaying organic matter of living things. Here, there are no living things to decay. The wind howls across the continents without rustling a single leaf. The rain falls in torrential, violent sheets, unchecked by any roots, washing millions of tons of raw, pulverized rock directly back into the seas. The sun beats down with a terrifying intensity, bathing the exposed rock in raw ultraviolet radiation. To an observer from the modern world, this landscape looks like the surface of Mars. It is utterly hostile, aggressively toxic to anything that requires moisture to survive. And yet, this barren, sun-baked rock is the next great frontier. It is the ultimate prize. Because while the oceans are crowded, dangerous, and saturated with hungry mouths, the land is completely, wonderfully empty. As we continue our journey here on Earth's documentary, we are about to witness the single most courageous, desperate, and unlikely invasion in the history of the universe. The conquest of the land, the assault on the continents, does not begin with a daring fish crawling out of the water. That dramatic moment is still tens of millions of years away. The true pioneers of the terrestrial world are entirely silent, and they do not have legs, lungs, or eyes. The very first conquerors are the fungi and the plants. At the very edge of the water, where the tides crash against the barren rock, a microscopic alliance is forming. In the damp splash zone, ancient fungi merge with photosynthetic algae to create lichen. This is a brilliant biological partnership. The algae capture the harsh sunlight and turn it into energy, while the fungi anchor the organism to bare rock and secrete powerful organic acids. These acids slowly, molecule by molecule, begin to dissolve the solid stone, extracting the raw minerals trapped inside. This slow-motion chemical warfare against the Earth's crust produces a miraculous byproduct. As the rock breaks down and the lichen dies and decays, the very first primitive dustings of soil begin to accumulate in the cracks and crevices of the continents. With this microscopic foothold established, The earliest true plants begin to creep out of the shallow waters. These are not trees or bushes. They are liverworts and primitive mosses, tiny, delicate green films that hug the damp edges of the rivers and coastlines. They don't have true roots. They don't have leaves, and they don't have seeds. They reproduce using spores that must swim through a film of water to fertilize one another, completely tying their existence to the damp margins of the land. But as these ancient mosses grow, die, and decay over millions of years, they build upon the soil created by the lichen. By the time we reach the late Silurian and early Devonian periods, the edges of the continents are painted in a vibrant, creeping green. But if you were to walk through this early terrestrial landscape, you would encounter a structure so utterly bizarre that it challenges our fundamental understanding of what life should look like. Rising out of the low carpets of moss are massive, towering pillars. They look like the trunks of giant, leafless trees, perfectly straight and tapering at the top. Some of them reach an astonishing 24 feet into the sky, casting long, dark shadows over the primitive green landscape. But these are not trees. Trees have not been invented yet. These towering obelisks are called prototaxites. For decades, scientists argued over what prototaxites actually was. Was it a giant piece of rolled-up algae? Was it a bizarre, early experiment in plant life? The answer, revealed by analyzing the microscopic structure of its fossilized rings, is far stranger. Prototaxites was a fungus. It was a gargantuan, 24-foot-tall mushroom spire dominating the terrestrial skyline. For over 40 million years, these colossal fungal towers were the largest living things on land, silently dispersing billions of spores into the ancient wind. This alien landscape, a world of knee-high mosses and towering fungal pillars, has finally created a habitable zone above the water. There is now shade to hide from the lethal UV radiation. There is damp soil to prevent drying out. And most importantly, there is an untouched, endless buffet of plant and fungal matter just waiting to be eaten. The table is set. The oceans are brimming with armored predators. It is only a matter of time before someone realizes that salvation lies on the beach. The first animals to drag themselves out of water and leave footprints in the damp Devonian mud are not our ancestors. The chordates, the animals with internal skeletons, are still trapped in the oceans, fighting for their lives. The true vanguard, the first animals to breathe the open air, are the undisputed masters of armor, the arthropods. For the arthropods, leaving the water was a stroke of absolute evolutionary genius. That rigid, jointed exoskeleton that had evolved in the Cambrian oceans to protect them from the crushing jaws of Anomalocaris and the giant nautiloids turns out to have a miraculous secondary function. An exoskeleton is essentially a biological spacesuit, just as it keeps the ocean out. It also keeps water in. The thick layer of chitin prevents the animal's internal moisture from evaporating into the dry air, solving the single greatest challenge of terrestrial life, desiccation. Fossilized tracks in ancient sandstone reveal the moment this invasion occurred. We see the delicate, parallel scratch marks of early millipedes, animals like Pneumodesmus numini, venturing out onto the mudflats. We see the ominous, dragging tail marks of early scorpions. These ancient arachnids were amphibious, hunting in the shallow waters and dragging their prey up onto the mossy banks to feed in absolute safety, free from the terrifying jaws that patrol the deep. To survive up here, these pioneering arthropods have to solve a second massive problem: breathing. Gills, which are designed to extract dissolved oxygen from water, are completely useless in the air. The moment a gill is exposed to the wind, its delicate filaments collapse, sticking together like wet hair, and the animal suffocates. The arthropods solve this by internalizing their respiratory systems. They evolve tiny holes along the sides of their bodies called spiracles. These holes lead into a network of microscopic tubes called tracheae that deliver atmospheric oxygen directly to their tissues. The scorpions take a different route, evolving book lungs, stacks of delicate, blood-filled tissue tucked safely inside a protective cavity in their abdomens, keeping the respiratory surface moist while absorbing the rich atmospheric oxygen. With desiccation and respiration solved, the arthropods absolutely explode across the land. Mites, early spiders, and millipedes swarm through the decaying mosses and giant fungal spires. The continents are finally alive. The silence of the rock is broken by the scratching of millions of tiny, armored legs. But while the arthropods are enjoying a predator-free paradise on land, the situation back in the ocean has reached a state of terrifying apocalyptic violence. Welcome to the Devonian period, an era stretching from 419 to 358 million years ago. Paleontologists call this the Age of Fishes, but a more accurate title might be the Age of the Jaw. For millions of years, the early vertebrates, our ancestors, the ostracoderms, have been heavily armored, swimming fortresses. But they were jawless. Their mouths were essentially open holes or muscular vacuums used to suck up mud and filter out organic detritus. They were bottom feeders, hiding from the giant sea scorpions and the massive, jet-propelled cephalopods. But evolution is relentless. At some point, in the genetic code of an ancient fish, a developmental error occurs. The very first pair of gill arches, the V-shaped cartilaginous struts that support the gills, mutates. Instead of just holding the gills open, these arches become slightly enlarged. They develop a hinge, and they move forward, surrounding the mouth. This simple, accidental shift in architecture changes the balance of power on planet Earth forever. It is the invention of the biting jaw. Suddenly, vertebrates are no longer relegated to sucking mud. With a hinged jaw, they can grasp, they can tear, they can crush, they can fight back. The first group of fish to truly weaponize this new invention are the placoderms. And the placoderms are the stuff of absolute nightmares. They retain the heavy, bony armor of their jawless ancestors, wrapping their heads and chests in thick, articulated plates of solid bone. But now they have massive, heavily muscled jaws. The undisputed tyrant of the Devonian seas, the apex predator of the entire globe, is a monstrous placoderm named Dunkleosteus. Imagine a fish the size of a modern school bus, reaching lengths of up to 30 feet and weighing over 4 tons. The entire front half of its body is encased in a thick, impregnable helmet of dark bone. Dunkleosteus doesn't have true teeth. Instead, the bony plates of its skull extend downward past its mouth, creating massive, self-sharpening biological guillotines. Every time Dunkleosteus opens and closes its mouth, the bony plates slide against each other, grinding their edges into razor-sharp shears. Biomechanists have modeled the bite force of Dunkleosteus, and the results are staggering. This Devonian fish could bite with force rivaling that of Tyrannosaurus rex, capable of effortlessly snapping a modern great white shark completely in half, and could open its mouth in 1/50th of a second, creating a massive underwater vacuum that literally sucked its prey into its jaws before slamming shut with the force of a falling anvil. With monsters like Dunkleosteus patrolling the open oceans, survival for smaller fish becomes a desperate, hourly struggle. The armored placoderms are a terrifying success, but they are heavy, slow, and energetically expensive to maintain. To survive the Devonian arms race, the fish lineage splits into 2 entirely new design philosophies. 2 different strategies to avoid the jaws of the placoderms. The first strategy is speed. A new group of fish abandons the heavy external bone armor entirely. They lighten their skeletons, shrink their scales, and evolve delicate, translucent fins supported by thin, flexible rays of bone. These are the ray-finned fishes. They opt for agility, darting through the coral reefs, accelerating in a fraction of a second to outmaneuver the lumbering placoderms. This strategy is so incredibly successful that ray-finned fishes make up 99% of all fish alive today. Every salmon, tuna, goldfish, and shark you have ever seen is a descendant of this lineage that chose speed over armor. But there was a second strategy. A much smaller, much weirder group of fish decided that instead of outswimming the monsters in the open ocean, they would simply hide where the monsters couldn't go. These are the lobe-finned fishes, and their story is our story. To escape the open water terrors, the lobe-finned fishes retreat into the shallow, murky margins of the continents. They push into the coastal swamps, the choked, tangled estuaries, and the stagnant, muddy rivers winding their way inland. Dunkleosteus and the giant marine predators are too massive to follow them into waters that are only a few feet deep. But the shallows come with their own deadly challenges. The water here is warm, choked with decaying plant matter, washing off the land, and completely stagnant. Warm, stagnant water holds very little dissolved oxygen. The lobe-finned fishes are safe from the jaws of the apex predators, but they are slowly suffocating. To survive in these hypoxic swamps, They perform an astonishing anatomical trick. They possess an outpocketing of their gut, a simple, balloon-like sac that they normally use to control their buoyancy. But as the oxygen in the water plummets, these fish begin to surface. They break the tension of the water and gulp the open air. The oxygen diffuses through the walls of that simple gut sac directly into their bloodstream. They have just invented the lung. For the first time, a vertebrate animal is breathing atmospheric air. Today, we still have remnants of this ancient lineage, the modern lungfishes, living in the stagnant swamps of Africa, South America, and Australia. When their ponds dry up completely during the dry season, lungfishes will burrow into the mud, secrete a cocoon of mucus around themselves, and survive for months or even years, breathing entirely through their lungs until rains return. But the lobe-finned fishes possess another strange anatomical quirk, one that will prove even more significant than the lung. It is the very feature that gives them their name. If you look at the fin of a ray-finned fish like a trout, it is just a fan of delicate, parallel bones. But if you look at the fin of a lobe-finned fish, it is something entirely different. The fin is attached to the body by a single, thick, robust bone. Below that single bone are two smaller bones. And below those two bones is a complex cluster of tiny, pebble-like bones, fanning out into fin rays. One bone, two bones, lots of blobs. Look down at your own arm right now. Attached to your shoulder is a single, thick bone, the humerus. Below your elbow are two smaller bones, the radius and the ulna. Below your wrist is a complex cluster of tiny, pebble-like carpal bones, fanning out into your fingers. The architecture of your arm, the limb that allows you to build cities, paint masterpieces, and turn the pages of a book, was forged 380 million years ago in the muddy, stagnant swamps of the Devonian period. It was designed not for walking on land, but for dragging a heavy fish body through tangled underwater roots and pushing through dense, choked vegetation where swimming was impossible. The lobe-finned fishes are thriving in the shallows, but the environment is highly unstable. Devonian seasons are harsh. During intense droughts, the shallow ponds shrink into isolated muddy puddles. The fish are trapped. As the water evaporates, the puddles become crowded, overheated, and starved of oxygen. To survive, an animal must find a way to drag itself out of its shrinking puddle, haul its heavy body across the sun-baked mud, and plunge into the next deeper pool of water. This desperate, muddy scramble is a crucible that forces a fin to become a leg. For decades, paleontologists scoured the globe looking for the fossilized evidence of this exact transition. They knew that the early lobe-finned fishes lived in water, and they knew that the first amphibians walked on land. But they needed to find the missing link, the creature caught exactly halfway between fish and tetrapod. In 2004, deep in the freezing, desolate expanse of the Canadian Arctic on Ellesmere Island, a team of paleontologists finally found it, entombed in 375-million-year-old rock. They discovered the beautifully preserved remains of a creature they named Tiktaalik rosei. Tiktaalik is one of the most important fossils ever discovered, because it is a perfect, beautiful snapshot of evolution caught in the act. If you look at the back half of Tiktaalik, it is undeniably a fish. It has scales, it has gills, and it has a long, fin tail designed for swimming. But if you look at the front half, it looks like a crocodile. It has a flat, triangular skull with eyes positioned squarely on the top of its head, perfectly adapted for an animal hiding just below the surface of the water, looking up at the sky. But the true magic of Tiktaalik lies in its front limbs. When paleontologists painstakingly cleared the rock away from its pectoral fins, they found the exact skeletal structure of a limb. One bone, two bones, a cluster of wrist bones, and the faint, primitive beginnings of fingers. Tiktaalik possessed the very first wrist in the history of the Earth. It couldn't walk on land like a dog, but it could do a push-up. It could plant its fleshy fins onto mud of a drying pond, flex its primitive wrists, and heave its heavy, flat head out of the water to gulp the air. And Tiktaalik possessed one more crucial innovation. In a normal fish, the skull is fused directly to the shoulder bones. A fish cannot turn its head. To look to the side, it has to turn its entire body. But Tiktaalik had lost the bony plates connecting its head to its shoulders. It had a neck. Imagine this creature, 375 million years ago, In a sweltering Devonian swamp, the water is receding. Tiktaalik plants its strong, fleshy fins into the muck. It pushes its upper body out of the water. Its lungs expand, pulling in the rich, atmospheric oxygen. And then, using its newly evolved neck, it turns its head side to side, scanning the desolate, muddy shore. It is a fish, but it is a fish that is looking at the dry land with intent. The transition is excruciatingly slow. Evolution does not happen overnight. For millions of years, these transitional creatures hover at the water's edge. They are amphibians in the truest sense of the word, living a double life. By the late Devonian, roughly 365 million years ago, the fin has finally completed its transformation into a fully articulated foot. In the fossil beds of Greenland, we find the remains of Acanthostega. Acanthostega is a tetrapod, a four-legged vertebrate. It has a distinct femur, tibia, and fibula in its hind legs, and fully formed ankles and toes. But when paleontologists counted the toes on Acanthostega's foot, they found something shocking. It didn't have 5 toes like modern humans, dogs, or lizards. It had 8, and its arms were completely unsuited to bear its weight on land. The joints were angled backward. If Acanthostega tried to walk on the dry beach, its belly would drag heavily on the rock, and its legs would splay out uselessly to the sides. Furthermore, it still had fully functioning internal gills. This discovery completely flipped our understanding of the invasion of land. For a century, we assumed that fish evolved legs to walk on the land. Acanthostega proved that this was backwards. Legs did not evolve on land. Legs evolved in the water. The 8-toed feet of Acanthostega were essentially biological paddles, designed to navigate the incredibly dense, tangled, weed-choked swamps of the late Devonian. They were using their legs to walk on the underwater roots and push through the submerged vegetation, not to stroll on the beach. Legs were an aquatic adaptation. Walking on land was just a happy, accidental byproduct that would be exploited millions of years later. But the push to leave the water was becoming undeniable, and the land they were staring at was undergoing a radical, violent transformation of its own. While the fish were fighting for survival in the swamps, the plants had been busy. The tiny, creeping mosses and liverworts had evolved vascular tissue, internal plumbing that allowed them to pull water up from the soil and transport it against the force of gravity. Armed with this new plumbing, the plants began to grow upward, racing each other toward the sun. They evolved a tough, rigid organic polymer called lignin, which allowed them to build sturdy, woody stems. By the middle of the Devonian, the first true trees appear in the fossil record. And by the late Devonian, a tree called Archaeopteryx begins to form the very first vast continental forests. Archaeopteryx looked much like a modern conifer, reaching up to 100 feet into the air with an extensive canopy of fern-like leaves. And as these trees pushed upward, their root systems plunged downward. The roots of these first forests shattered the rocks of the continents, plunging deep into the Earth's crust, accelerating the weathering process to a staggering degree. The invention of the forest fundamentally rewrites the atmosphere of planet Earth. Billions of towering trees are inhaling carbon dioxide at an unprecedented rate, locking the carbon away in their woody trunks and exhaling massive clouds of pure oxygen. The oxygen levels on Earth begin to surge, eventually approaching a hyperoxygenated state that will have profound consequences for the size of the animals breathing it. But there is a dark side to this botanical explosion. By aggressively pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, the first forests are destroying the greenhouse blanket that has kept the Earth warm for tens of millions of years. The planet begins to rapidly cool. Simultaneously, the deep, shattering roots of the new forest release unimaginable quantities of trapped minerals into the rivers. This massive influx of nutrients washes out into the oceans, triggering cataclysmic algae blooms. The algae grow out of control, die, and sink to the bottom, where bacteria consume them and the oxygen. The oceans are suffocating again. As the Devonian period draws to a close, a new, agonizing extinction event grips the planet. The late Devonian mass extinction is a prolonged, multi-pulse disaster that stretches over 20 million years. It is particularly devastating to the marine ecosystem. The great coral reef systems of the world completely collapse, and they will not recover for 100 million years. And the mighty placoderms, the armored terrors of the deep, including the bus-sized, bone-crushing Dunkleistus, are entirely wiped off the face of the earth. The age of fishes ends in an apocalyptic wave of cold and suffocation. But up in the shallow, muddy swamps, hiding beneath the roots of the world's first great forests, the four-legged survivors cling to life. They have lungs to breathe the air when the water goes stagnant. They have legs to drag themselves to new ponds when the old ones dry up. The oceans belong to the dead, but the land is green, rich with oxygen and crawling with slow, armored arthropods just waiting to be eaten. The great vertebrate invasion is finally ready to begin. The descendants of the mud-crawling Tiktaalik are about to step out of the shadows, shake the water from their scaly skin, and inherit the earth. The transition is complete. The boundary has been crossed. Our ancestors have arrived on the shore, and as the Devonian cold gives way to the steaming, hyper-oxygenated jungles of the Carboniferous period, the rules of biology are about to be stretched to their absolute, terrifying limits. Because in a world with no large predators, infinite food, and an atmosphere overflowing with oxygen, the insects and the amphibians are about to grow to sizes that defy imagination. But that is a story for the next chapter of Earth's documentary. Step out of the dying, cold waters of the late Devonian and pull your heavy, wet body onto muddy banks of the Carboniferous period. The first thing you notice is the air. It is heavy, thick, and almost intoxicating. Breathing it in feels like a rush of pure adrenaline. Your lungs burn with an energy you have never felt before. You look up, but you cannot see the sky. It is completely blocked out by a towering, oppressive canopy of green. But these are not oak trees or pines. They are alien, nightmarish towering structures. Massive club mosses, horsetails, and scale trees, some reaching more than 100 feet into the misty air. Their trunks do not have regular bark. They are covered in overlapping, diamond-shaped patterns that look exactly like the scales of a giant reptile. Welcome to the Carboniferous, an era stretching from 359 to 299 million years ago. The continents have drifted into the tropical latitudes, and the endless, barren deserts of the past have been replaced by the largest, densest, and most expansive swamp forest the Earth will ever see. This world is an absolute paradise of moisture and shade. But there is a massive biological glitch in this ancient ecosystem, a missing piece of the evolutionary puzzle that is about to alter the chemistry of the entire planet. In these vast, sprawling swamps, trees grow, age, and eventually fall into the shallow, stagnant water. Today, when a tree falls in a forest, fungi and bacteria quickly break it down, causing it to rot. This rotting process consumes oxygen and releases carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. But in the Carboniferous, the trees have evolved a rigid, complex internal polymer called lignin to hold themselves upright. And the microscopic world has not yet figured out how to digest it. The bacteria and fungi are completely baffled by this new biological armor. So, the trees do not rot. They simply fall and stack up, millions upon millions of dead. Scaly trunks pile on top of each other in the anoxic swamp water, layer after layer, century after century, for tens of millions of years. The sheer weight of these dead forests compresses the organic matter down, squeezing the water out, baking it under tectonic pressure. This is where the coal comes from. Every lump of coal ever burned in a steam engine, every piece of coal that fueled the Industrial Revolution, powered the first trains, and lit up the modern human world, is a compressed, fossilized remains of these exact, unrotting Carboniferous swamps. We are literally still burning the shadow of this ancient era today. But because these dead trees are not decomposing, something spectacular is happening to the air. The carbon is being buried in the earth, but the oxygen those trees produced while they were alive is being left behind in the atmosphere. The oxygen levels on planet Earth begin to skyrocket, climbing past modern levels of 21%, soaring to 30%, and eventually peaking at a staggering 35%. The atmosphere is so saturated with pure oxygen that the air itself is highly volatile. A single lightning strike during a tropical storm doesn't just start a localized fire. It triggers massive, catastrophic firestorms that rage across the continents, burning with intensity and heat that would melt modern steel. The fossil record is packed with layers of thick, ancient charcoal, a testament to a world that was constantly, violently catching fire. But for the animals living in the shadows of this hyper-oxygenated swamp, This atmosphere is a biological steroid. In normal atmospheric conditions, arthropods, insects, spiders, and millipedes are severely limited in how large they can grow. They do not have lungs. They breathe through a network of tiny tubes called tracheae that passively diffuse oxygen into their tissues. If an insect gets too big, the oxygen simply cannot penetrate deep enough, and the animal suffocates from the inside out. But in a world with 35% oxygen, that limit completely vanishes. The air is so rich that oxygen forces its way deep into the tissues of even the most massive bodies. The arthropods, those armored pioneers who had conquered the land millions of years earlier, seize this opportunity and mutate into monsters. If you are walking to the damp undergrowth of the Carboniferous swamp, you might hear a deep, terrifying rustling in the dead ferns. Emerging from the shadows is Arthropleura. It looks like a modern millipede, but is 8 feet long and 3 feet wide. It is the size of a modern car, a heavily armored, multi-legged tank slithering through the mud. It rears its head up to eye level, its massive antennae tasting the thick air. While it is likely a vegetarian, feeding on the rotting spores and fallen vegetation, its sheer size makes an unstoppable, armored behemoth of the forest floor. But the true terror comes from above. The air is filled with a low, thrumming buzz, a sound like the distant rotors of a helicopter. Darting through the giant, scaly tree trunks is Meganeura. It looks exactly like a dragonfly, but its wingspan is over 2.5 feet across. It is an aerial apex predator the size of an eagle. With its massive compound eyes tracking every movement in the swamp below, it swoops down at terrifying speeds, extending its spiky legs to pluck unsuspecting, lizard-sized amphibians right out of the mud, carrying them off into the canopy to be eaten alive. There are scorpions the size of dogs hunting in the shallows. There are spiders the size of dinner plates weaving webs between the giant ferns. The Carboniferous is the undisputed empire of the giant insects. But the vertebrates, our four-legged ancestors who dragged themselves out of the Devonian waters, have not been idle. They have evolved into the masters of the muddy water. These are the early tetrapods, the ancestors of all modern amphibians. And in the warm, endless swamps, they grow to horrifying sizes. Forget the tiny, delicate frogs and salamanders of today. The amphibians of the Carboniferous are massive, heavily muscled predators built like modern crocodiles. Creatures like Crassigyrinus, a 7-foot-long ambush predator with a massive, heavy skull packed with rows of razor-sharp teeth, patrol the dark, tannin-stained waters. They lie perfectly still just beneath the surface, waiting for a giant insect or a smaller vertebrate to step too close to the edge before exploding out of the water with terrifying speed. These giant amphibians are the undisputed kings of the swamp, but for all their size and all their ferocious power, they are prisoners. They are chained to the water by the very biology of their birth. Amphibian skin is highly permeable. It must stay moist to help them breathe and survive. If they wander too far into the dry interior of the continent, the sun bakes the moisture out of their bodies, and they desiccate and die. And more importantly, their reproduction is entirely aquatic. They lay soft, jelly-like eggs that have no protective shell. If those eggs are laid on dry land, they will shrivel into dust in a matter of hours. The amphibians must return to the water to mate, and their young must be born in the water, breathing through gills before undergoing metamorphosis. They rule the edge of the water, but the vast, dry, rocky interiors of the continents remain totally out of their reach. But deep in the underbrush, in the drier, elevated patches of the forest where the giant amphibians cannot go, a quiet, brilliant revolution is taking place. A small, lizard-like creature, hiding from the giant dragonflies, is about to break the chains of the ocean forever. This tiny creature does not return to the water to mate. Instead, it finds a hollow under a rotting log, and it lays an egg. But this is not a blob of permeable jelly. This egg is encased in a tough, leathery outer shell. This is the invention of the amniotic egg, and it is arguably the most important evolutionary leap since the invention of the spine. Inside that leathery shell is a miracle of biological engineering. It contains its own private miniature ocean, the amniotic fluid, which surrounds and protects the developing embryo. It contains a massive yolk sac, a highly concentrated food source that provides all the nutrients the baby needs to grow. It has a specialized sac called the allantois to store toxic waste products away from the embryo. And the shell itself is a semi-permeable marvel. It allows oxygen to filter in and carbon dioxide to filter out, while keeping the precious water locked safely inside. This is a biological spacesuit. It is a self-contained life support system. The creatures that lay these eggs no longer need the swamp. They don't need the ponds or the rivers to reproduce. They have brought the ocean with them, packaged neatly in a leathery shell. These animals are the very first amniotes. They are the ancestors of all reptiles, all birds, and all mammals. For the first time in the history of planet Earth, a vertebrate animal is completely 100% terrestrial. It is born on the land, it lives on the land, and it dies on the land. And they have evolved this superpower at the exact right moment in geological history, because the endless humid paradise of the Carboniferous is about to violently collapse. As the millions of years tick by, the continents continue their relentless drift. The massive southern landmass of Gondwana slides directly over the South Pole. The Earth, which had been locked in an intense greenhouse state, rapidly begins to cool. The massive forests that had sucked the carbon dioxide out of the air have done their job too well. The greenhouse blanket is gone. Massive glaciers begin to form at the poles, locking up unimaginably vast quantities of the world's water as solid ice. Sea levels plummet. The global climate shifts from a humid, tropical greenhouse to an arid, cold icehouse. This is the Carboniferous rainforest collapse. The endless global swamp shatters. The lush, damp forests die back, replaced by vast, dry, sweeping deserts and arid plains. The giant club mosses and scaled trees cannot survive without the constant moisture, and they wither into extinction, replaced by hardy, drought-resistant seed ferns and early conifers. As the trees die off, the oxygen levels crash back down to Earth. The hyperoxygenated atmosphere thins out. For the giant arthropods, the drop in oxygen is a death sentence. The colossal, car-sized millipedes and the eagle-sized dragonflies suddenly find themselves suffocating in the thinning air. Their massive bodies simply cannot draw in enough oxygen through their passive tracheae. One by one, the giants collapse into the mud and go extinct, yielding the skies and the forest floor back to their smaller, more efficient cousins. For the giant amphibians, the collapse of the swamps is an apocalypse. Their watery kingdoms evaporate, shrinking into isolated, muddy puddles. Stranded, unable to cross the vast, newly formed deserts because their skin will dry out, the great amphibian kings die out in droves. But for the tiny, unassuming amniotes, the creatures with the leathery eggs and the dry, scaly skin that holds moisture inside, the death of the swamp is the greatest opportunity in history. They watch from the dry brush as the amphibians perish. They don't need the water. Their scaly skin acts as a barrier against a harsh, dry wind. Their efficient kidneys conserve water, and their shelled eggs can be laid directly in the arid sand. The swamps have died, but the dry land is wide open. The amniotes walk out of the shrinking mud and boldly step into the arid interior of the continents. They have inherited the earth. The calendar turns once more. We cross the boundary into the Permian period, stretching from 299 to 252 million years ago. The Earth you see now is entirely unrecognizable from the fractured islands of the Cambrian or the endless swamps of the Carboniferous. The slow-motion tectonic car crash that has been playing out for hundreds of millions of years reaches its violent, spectacular climax. The continents of Laurentia, Baltica, and the massive Gondwana slam into one another with unimaginable force. The crust of the Earth buckles and folds, throwing up mountain ranges the size of the Himalayas deep in the interior of the landmass. When the dust finally settles, there are no longer scattered continents. There's only one, Pangaea, a single colossal supercontinent that stretches from the North Pole all the way to the South Pole, surrounded by a single, unimaginably vast global ocean called Panthalassa. Because Pangaea is so massive, the moisture from the ocean simply cannot reach its deep interior. The center of the supercontinent is a brutal, scorching, hyper-arid desert, a landscape of sweeping sand dunes, baked rock, and extreme, violent temperature swings. Only the hardiest of the drought-resistant seed plants and conifers can survive here. But the amniotes, those scaly pioneers who escaped the dying swamps, are ready for this harsh new reality. in the crucible of the Permian deserts, they rapidly diversify, splitting into two distinct, warring dynasties that will battle for supremacy over the Earth for the next 300 million years. This evolutionary fork in the road is defined by a tiny, almost imperceptible difference in the architecture of their skulls. One group develops two holes in the skull behind each eye socket, designed to lighten the head and provide anchor points for stronger jaw muscles. These are the diapsids. They are the ancestors of all modern lizards, snakes, crocodile, dinosaurs, and eventually birds. The other group develops only a single hole in the skull behind the eye. These are the synapsids, and they are our ancestors. The stem mammals. In the modern world, the mammals are the dominant terrestrial animals. We look at reptiles as primitive, cold-blooded relics. But in the early Permian period, 300 million years ago, the exact opposite was true. The ancestors of the reptiles were small, lizard-like creatures scurrying in the shadows. It was our ancestors, the synapsids, who rose up to become the absolute, terrifying masters of Pangaea. If you were to walk across the dusty, red plains of the early Permian, the most magnificent and terrifying creature you would encounter is a synapsid named Dimetrodon. Dimetrodon is arguably one of the most famous prehistoric animals in the world, and it is almost universally incorrectly called a dinosaur. You see it in toy boxes right next to the T-Rex. But Dimetrodon is not a dinosaur. It is not even a reptile. It lived and died 40 million years before the very first dinosaur ever existed. It is closer on the evolutionary family tree to a human being than it is to a velociraptor. It is a massive, sprawling predator, stretching up to 15 feet long, with a heavy, muscular body and a massive skull. But its most striking feature is a spectacular, towering sail rising out of its back. This sail is supported by elongated neural spines projecting straight up from its vertebrae, covered in a web of highly vascularized skin. For decades, paleontologists debated the purpose of this bizarre structure. Was it for intimidation? Was it a display to attract mates? The prevailing theory is that it was a masterpiece of primitive thermal engineering. The Permian nights were freezing, and the mornings were lethargic. Dimetrodon, like most animals of its time, was likely cold-blooded, relying on the environment to heat its body. But with that massive sail, Dimetrodon had a biological solar panel. At the break of dawn, it would position its body perpendicular to the rising sun, pumping cold blood from its core up into the vast surface area of the sail. The sun would rapidly heat the blood, which was then pumped back down into the body, acting as an internal radiator. While the early reptiles and amphibians were still sluggish and frozen from the cold night, waiting hours for the ambient air to warm them, Dimetrodon was fully charged, hot, and ready to hunt. It could stalk through the cold morning mist and slaughter its frozen, immobilized prey with terrifying ease. But the true secret to Dimetrodon's success and the hallmark of our mammalian lineage lay in its mouth. The name Dimetrodon literally translates to 2 measures of teeth. If you look at a crocodile or a T-Rex, every tooth in their head is exactly the same shape, just different sizes of the same crushing peg or slicing blade. But Dimetrodon had evolved something revolutionary: specialized dentition. It had sharp, dagger-like canines at the front for grabbing and puncturing struggling prey, and smaller, shearing teeth at the back for slicing meat off the bone. This simple division of labor in the mouth is the foundation of the mammalian bite. It allowed our ancestors to process food more efficiently, extracting more energy from every kill, fueling higher metabolisms and more active lifestyles. As the millions of years of the Permian roll on, Pangaea becomes even drier, and the climate becomes even more extreme. Dimetrodon and the sailbacks and napsids eventually fade away, replaced by an even more advanced, highly evolved group of stem mammals. These are the therapsids, and the apex predators among the therapsids are the gorgonopsians. If you want to picture a gorgonopsian, imagine taking a wolf, a grizzly bear, and a Komodo dragon and violently smashing their DNA together into one creature. They range in size from that of medium dog to massive, hulking predators the size of a rhinoceros, like Inostrancevia. They had lost the sprawling, lizard-like stance of Dimetrodon. Instead, their legs had moved underneath their bodies, giving them an upright, powerful, bounding gait. They could run down prey over the open plains with terrifying speed and stamina. Their skulls were massive, blocky, and heavily reinforced to withstand extreme bite forces. And projecting from their upper jaws were the very first saber teeth in the history of the Earth. Massive, serrated fangs extending past their lower jaws, designed to slash through the thick hides of the giant armor herbivores that roamed the Permian deserts. There is tantalizing evidence that these Gorgonopsians were taking the first, crucial steps toward warm-bloodedness. Their bone structure suggests rapid growth rates, and there are hints in the fossil record, tiny pits on their snouts, that suggest they may have possessed whiskers, which in turn strongly implies they may have been covered in early, primitive fur to insulate their heat-generating bodies against the cold Permian nights. They were fast. They were powerful. They had specialized, lethal teeth. The Gorgonopsians were the undisputed, unchallenged kings of Pangaea. The Synapsid Empire was at its absolute zenith. The mammalian blueprint was proving to be the most lethal and effective design on the entire supercontinent. The world of the late Permian is a complex, fully realized, thriving global ecosystem. Giant, herd-dwelling herbivores graze on the tough ferns. Nimble, insect-eating reptiles dart through the rocks. The Gorgonopsians patrol the dusty plains, the absolute masters of their domain. The Earth has recovered from the collapse of the Carboniferous swamps, and life has fully adapted to the brutal reality of Pangaea. It seems as though the synapsids will rule the Earth forever, eventually evolving seamlessly into true mammals without interruption. But evolution is not a promise, and the Earth is a merciless, chaotic host. As the Gorgonopsians hunt under the baking sun, deep beneath the crust of the supercontinent, in a region that will one day become Siberia, something is stirring. A massive plume of unimaginably hot magma, welling up from the deep mantle, is pressing against the bottom of the tectonic plate. The crust is beginning to bulge. It is beginning to crack. The greatest, most complex, and most successful terrestrial ecosystem the world has ever seen is completely unaware that a geological time bomb has just hit zero. The Paleozoic era is in its final, dying moments. The sky is about to turn black. The oceans are about to turn acid, and life on Earth is about to face its ultimate, darkest hour. The great dying is about to begin. Deep in the heart of what we now call Siberia, the Earth does not just erupt, it unzips. There is no singular, towering volcano blowing its top in a sudden, dramatic explosion. Instead, a fissure opens in the crust of the supercontinent, a crack in the solid ground, glowing with blinding, white-hot intensity, stretching for dozens of miles. Then another crack opens, and another. Soon, an area of land roughly the size of Western Europe is crisscrossed with jagged, bleeding wounds pouring liquid fire directly onto the surface of the Earth. This is the Siberian Traps. It is an event known as a continental flood basalt, and it is the single most violent, sustained volcanic event in the history of the planet. But it is not the lava that kills the world. The lava is just a trigger for an apocalyptic chain reaction that systematically dismantles the global ecosystem piece by piece. As the millions of cubic miles of magma push their way up toward the surface, they do not just melt through barren rock. They intersect with the massive, buried coal beds laid down millions of years earlier during the Carboniferous period. The magma ignites these subterranean oceans of coal. The Earth is now burning its own fossil fuels on a planetary scale. Billions of tons of carbon dioxide and toxic sulfur dioxide are blasted into the atmosphere. The sky, once clear and blue, turns a sickly, suffocating yellow. The sulfur mixes with atmospheric moisture, creating global downpours of concentrated sulfuric acid. The acid rain strips the leaves from the drought-resistant seed ferns. It scorches the ancient conifers. It washes into the lakes and shallow seas, turning the water toxic and dissolving the calcium carbonate shells of the marine invertebrates. But the true horror is the heat. The massive influx of carbon dioxide triggers a runaway greenhouse effect. Global temperatures violently spike. The oceans, absorbing this unimaginable heat, begin to warm like water in a cauldron. And as the oceans warm, they lose their ability to hold dissolved oxygen. The ocean currents, driven by the temperature differences between the equator and the poles, slowly grind to a halt. The great Panthalassic Ocean goes stagnant. At the bottom of this stagnant, overheating sea, a new nightmare awakens. Massive deposits of frozen methane clathrates, that have been trapped in the freezing depths for millions of years, suddenly melt. The methane, a greenhouse gas roughly 30 times more potent than carbon dioxide, bubbles up to the surface and enters the atmosphere, violently accelerating the global warming in a terrifying positive feedback loop. And as the oxygen in the oceans vanishes, the aerobic life, the fish, the ancient sharks, the coral reefs, suffocates and dies. But the death of the aerobic world is a feast for the anaerobic world. Deep in the suffocating abyss, certain strains of bacteria that do not need oxygen, bacteria that breathe sulfate and exhale hydrogen sulfide gas, begin to bloom in numbers that defy comprehension. They multiply until the oceans literally turn a sickly, bruised purple. The hydrogen sulfide gas, highly toxic to all oxygen-breathing life, bubbles up from the sea, saturating the atmosphere with the overwhelming stench of rotting eggs. This toxic gas doesn't just poison the animals on land. It rises high into the stratosphere, where it attacks and systematically shreds the ozone layer. With the ozone layer gone, the Earth is stripped of its biological shield. Raw, unfiltered ultraviolet radiation from the sun slams into the surface of Pangaea. The radiation is so intense that it fries the DNA of the surviving plants, rendering them completely sterile. The pollen and spores of the late Permian trees mutate into twisted, deformed shapes, completely unable to reproduce. The forests collapse. The food web shatters. This is the Permian-Triassic extinction event, the Great Dying. On land, the magnificent Gorgonopsians, the saber-toothed kings of the Synapsid Empire, find themselves starving in a poisoned, burning wasteland. The giant, armor herbivores they preyed upon collapse from heat stroke, starvation, and toxic gas. With no food, the massive apex predators slowly wither away, their reign ending not in a glorious battle, but in a desperate, coughing whimper under a scorching, unshielded sun. In the oceans, the devastation is almost absolute. The great reef systems are completely annihilated, leaving a reef gap in the fossil record that will last for millions of years. And the trilobites, those brilliant, armored survivors who had dominated the seas since the Cambrian Explosion, who had survived 270 million years of predators, ice ages, and shifting continents, finally run out of luck. The very last trilobite curls into a ball, suffocates in the acidic, purple water, and dies. When the fires finally burn out and the toxic skies begin to slowly clear, the mathematics of the apocalypse are revealed. Up to 96% of all marine species have been wiped out of existence. Roughly 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species are gone. The Earth has been pushed to the absolute brink of total biological sterilization. Life on this planet has never come closer to being entirely snuffed out. The calendar turns to 252 million years ago. We have entered the Triassic period. If you were to stand on the surface of Pangaea in the early Triassic, the silence would be deafening. The vibrant, thriving, complex global ecosystem of the Permian has been reduced to an endless, scorched, barren wasteland. There are no forests. There's a coal gap in the fossil record for millions of years because there simply is not enough plant life left on Earth to create peat. The continents are swept by massive, violent monsoons that wash the exposed, rootless soil directly into the dead, empty oceans. It is a world of ghosts, a planetary graveyard. But biology, clinging by its absolute fingernails, refuses to let go. In the ashes of the greatest apocalypse in history, a new cast of survivors emerges. Paleontologists call them the disaster taxa. These are the weeds of the animal kingdom, the generalists, the animals that can eat anything, live anywhere, and survive in the harshest, most degraded conditions imaginable. And the undisputed poster child of the Triassic apocalypse is a creature named Lystrosaurus. Lystrosaurus is a dicynodont, a distant, plant-eating relative of the mammalian lineage. To put it mildly, Lystrosaurus is not a majestic animal. It is roughly the size of a pig, with a barrel-shaped body, short, sprawling legs, and a face that looks like it ran full speed into a brick wall. It has a blunt, shovel-like snout, a beak like a turtle, and two small tusks protruding from its upper jaw. In the complex, highly competitive world of the Permian, Lystrosaurus was a nobody, a marginal, burrowing scavenger hiding in the dirt from the terrifying Gorgonopsians. But the Gorgonopsians are dead, and in a world where the surface is scorched by UV radiation and ravaged by toxic windstorms, being a burrower is the ultimate superpower. Lystrosaurus survived the apocalypse by digging deep underground, sheltering in cool, dark burrows. It uses its powerful, shovel-like face and tusks to dig up the dead, rotting roots of the burned forests. It doesn't eat fresh leaves. It can digest the tough, fibrous dead vegetation that nothing else can eat. It has an unusually large chest cavity, housing massive lungs that allow it to breathe the oxygen-depleted, stagnant air of the early Triassic. Because practically every single predator on Earth is dead, and all of its competitors have been wiped out, Lystrosaurus does something that no other animal has done before or since. It inherits the entire planet. In the early Triassic fossil beds, Lystrosaurus fossils don't disappear, they dominate. In some fossil sites from South Africa to Antarctica to China, Lystrosaurus makes up a staggering 95% of all terrestrial vertebrate fossils found. Think about that. For a brief, bizarre window in geological time, if you were to pick a vertebrate animal at random from anywhere on the surface of the Earth, there was a 95% chance it was a pig-sized, shovel-faced burrower. It is the most intense population bottleneck in the history of life. But Lystrosaurus cannot hold the throne forever. As the Earth very slowly begins to heal, as the global temperatures stabilize, the carbon dioxide levels drop, and the forests slowly begin to creep back across the brutal interior of Pangaea, the evolutionary arms race restarts. And the balance of power on planet Earth is about to undergo a radical, permanent shift. Before the Great Dying, our ancestors, the synapsids, ruled the world. But the apocalypse broke the back of the synapsid empire. The massive, warm-blooded predators were too specialized, required too much food, and were completely decimated. The surviving synapsids are forced to change their strategy. They shrink. They retreat into the shadows. They become small, nocturnal, burrowing insect eaters. Over the next tens of millions of years, they will evolve fur, they will evolve milk, and they will become the very first true mammals. But they will spend the next 160 million years living in terrified obscurity, scurrying under the cover of darkness, because the daylight now belongs to their rivals. The diapsids, the ancestors of the reptiles, who had spent the Permian as small, marginal lizards, suddenly find themselves standing on an empty game board, and the hot, hyper-arid desert climate of Triassic Pangaea perfectly plays to their biological strengths. The primary difference between a mammal and a reptile in the desert comes down to something as basic as going to the bathroom. Mammals and our synapsid ancestors process their cellular waste into urea, which must be dissolved in a large amount of water to safely flush it out of the body as liquid urine. If a mammal cannot find enough to drink, it will rapidly dehydrate and die just to clear its own toxins. Reptiles evolved a different pathway. They process their waste into uric acid, which requires almost no water to excrete. Instead of liquid, they excrete a thick white paste. This single biological hack means that a reptile can extract almost all the moisture it needs just from the food it eats. It does not need to drink standing water. In the baking, endless deserts of Pangaea, the reptile kidney is the ultimate weapon of conquest. Armed with supreme water conservation, the diapsids rapidly diversify, radiating out to fill every empty ecological niche left behind by the dying of the Permian monsters. And the group that rises to the absolute top of the food chain, becoming the undisputed apex predators of the Triassic period, are the archosaurs, the ruling reptiles. Today, the only surviving archosaurs are birds and crocodilians. But in the Triassic, the ancestors of crocodile were nothing like the low-slung, river-dwelling ambush predators we know today. The Triassic was the empire of the running, galloping, terrestrial crocodile. Imagine walking out onto the arid floodplains of the late Triassic, roughly 220 million years ago. The ground trembles. Bursting out from the sparse scrub brush is Phaseolacicus. It is an archosaur, closely related to modern crocodiles, but does not drag its belly on the ground. Its massive, muscular legs are positioned directly underneath its body like pillars. It is 25 feet long, armed with massive, heavy skull packed with serrated, steak-knife teeth. It can run in a full, terrifying gallop, chasing down giant, armored herbivores across the open plains. There are armored, spike-covered archosaurs called ettosaur, acting like reptilian armadillos. There are phytosaurs, heavily armored predators that look exactly like modern crocodiles but have their nostrils positioned directly between their eyes on the top of their heads, allowing them to breathe while completely submerged in the shallow lakes. The archosaurs are larger, faster, and more heavily armored than anything the Earth has seen since the Permian, and they possess one more massive biological advantage that allows them to completely dominate the synapsids. They invent a new way to breathe. When you and I take a breath, we pull air into the dead-end sac of our lungs, and then we have to push that exact same, depleted air back out the same tube before we can take another breath. It is a highly inefficient two-way street. We only extract a fraction of the oxygen from the air we inhale, but the archosaurs evolve an infinitely more complex system. Through a network of air sacs positioned throughout their bodies, they create a unidirectional airflow. The air moves through their lungs in one continuous loop. Even when they are exhaling, fresh, oxygen-rich air is being pushed across their lung tissue. It is a continuous, unstoppable engine of aerobic power. This highly efficient respiratory system, combined with their water-saving kidneys and their upright, pillar-like legs, makes the archosaurs the perfect biological machines for the hot, brutal world of Pangaea. The Triassic is firmly, undeniably the age of the crocodile. But once again, if we look past the massive, ruling titans of the era, if we look down into the dust and the shadows, we find a much smaller, marginalized creature trying desperately to survive. Amidst the thundering herds of giant archosaurs and the galloping, apex crocodile cousins, there's a tiny, two-legged reptile darting through the underbrush. It is only about the size of a golden retriever. It is lightly built, with hollow bones to reduce weight. It doesn't have the massive, bone-crushing jaws of Phaseolacicus. It is an insectivore, perhaps hunting small lizards and the tiny, furry, nocturnal mammals that are hiding in the dark. This small, skittish, bipedal runner is a creature like Eoraptor or perhaps Herosaurus. It is the very first dinosaur. For the first 30 million years of their existence, the dinosaurs are absolute nobodies. They are small, fragile, and utterly terrified of the giant archosaurs that rule the planet. If you were a time traveler visiting the late Triassic, you would never look at this tiny, fast-running reptile and predict that its descendants would one day shake the Earth, grow to be 100 feet long, and rule the planet for 165 million years. But this early dinosaur possesses a tiny anatomical quirk, a structural secret that will eventually unlock the world. In the hips of the giant, galloping crocodilians, the leg bone fits into a solid cup of bone in the pelvis. It works well, but it restricts their movement. The hip of the dinosaur is different. The cup of the pelvis has a hole right through the center of it, an open acetabulum. This hole allows the thigh bone of the dinosaur to lock perfectly into the hip socket at a sharp 90-degree angle. It completely frees the leg to swing directly forward and backward like a perfect pendulum. This doesn't seem like much, but this open hip joint allows the dinosaurs to stand completely upright, balanced perfectly on two legs, without expending any muscular energy just to keep their bodies off the ground. It frees their hands to grasp, to tear, and to fight. It makes them the most energy-efficient, rapid runners the terrestrial world has ever produced. But an efficient hip joint is not enough to overthrow the massive, ruling crocodile empire. The Rauisuchians and the Phytosaurs are simply too big, too powerful, and too entrenched in the global ecosystem. The dinosaurs cannot beat them in a fair fight. They are trapped in the underbrush, waiting for an opportunity that may never come. For the dinosaurs to inherit the Earth, they need a miracle. They need the current rulers of the planet to be completely, systematically removed. They need the game board to be violently upended one more time. And as the Triassic period draws to a close, roughly 201 million years ago, the Earth is more than happy to oblige. The colossal supercontinent of Pangaea, the massive, unified landmass that has defined the global climate for 100 million years, is becoming unstable. Deep in the mantle, unimaginable tectonic forces are pulling at the seams of the continent. Pangaea is about to tear itself in half. The rift begins exactly where North America, Europe, and Africa are welded together. As the continental crust pulls apart, it opens a massive, yawning chasm that will eventually become the Atlantic Ocean. But before the ocean can rush in, the tearing of the crust releases a nightmare that the Earth has not seen since the end of the Permian. Massive, planetary-scale volcanic rifts tear open along the tear, forming the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province. It is another continental flood basalt, pouring millions of cubic kilometers of liquid fire across the land. Once again, the sky turns black with ash and sulfur. Once again, the carbon dioxide levels violently spike, sending the global temperatures soaring into a runaway greenhouse effect. The oceans absorb the carbon, turning acidic, dissolving the delicate shells of the marine invertebrates. The climate swings wildly from searing heat to freezing volcanic winters. This is the Triassic-Jurassic mass extinction event. It is swift, it is brutal, and it is highly selective. The giant, galloping land crocodiles, the massive armored ichthyosaur, the phytosaurs lurking in the lakes. They are too large. They require too much food. Their populations collapse, and they are entirely wiped off the face of the earth. The great Archosaur empire, the Triassic, is burned to ash. When the smoke of this fourth great mass extinction finally clears, the dawn of the Jurassic period breaks over a shattered, empty world. The supercontinent is violently tearing itself apart, creating new, shallow seas and shifting the global climate from a dry, arid desert to a lush, humid, tropical greenhouse. The giant crocodilians are dead. The competition has been vaporized, but standing in the ashes, balanced perfectly on their two hind legs, with their hollow bones, their water-saving kidneys, and their highly efficient unidirectional lungs, are the survivors, the dinosaurs. They look out over the empty, greening landscape of the early Jurassic, and for the first time in their existence, there is nothing standing in their way. The shadows have lifted. The chains are broken. The long, terrifying wait is over. The age of reptiles is about to reach its terrifying, magnificent crescendo. The dinosaurs are about to step into the light, and they are about to grow. As the toxic ash of the Triassic-Jurassic extinction finally settles out of the atmosphere, a new dawn breaks over a fractured world. Welcome back to Earth's documentary. We have reached the turning point of the planet, the moment when the shadows recede, and the most legendary dynasty in the history of life finally takes the throne. The supercontinent of Pangaea is tearing itself apart. The massive, unified landmass that dictated the global climate for 100 million years is unzipping along a massive rift, allowing the ocean to rush into the deep chasms, creating the very first narrow iterations of the Atlantic Ocean. This continental breakup fundamentally changes the weather. The brutal, hyper-arid deserts of the Triassic are flooded with moisture. The world becomes a humid, lush, tropical greenhouse from pole to pole. There is no ice anywhere on the planet. The endless deserts are replaced by towering forests of conifers, ferns, and cycads. And wandering through these endless, steamy forests are the survivors, the dinosaurs. With the giant, galloping crocodilians completely wiped out by the extinction event, the dinosaurs find themselves staring at an empty, infinitely rich ecological canvas. And they respond to this absolute freedom by doing something that no land animal had ever done before, and no land animal has ever done since. They push the biological limits of flesh and bone to the absolute maximum. They become giants. This is the Jurassic period, and it is the age of the sauropod. If you were to stand in a Jurassic forest, roughly 150 million years ago, the ground would literally rhythmically shake beneath your feet. Moving through the canopy of the conifer trees are animals that defy the laws of gravity. Creatures like Brachiosaurus, Diplodocus, and Apatosaurus. A fully grown sauropod is a creature of almost incomprehensible scale. Imagine an animal 80, 90, or even 100 feet long, weighing up to 70 tons. That is the weight of 14 adult elephants combined into a single, walking mountain of muscle and bone. When a herd of sauropods moves across the floodplains, they consume entire forests, stripping thousands of pounds of vegetation every single day. But how is an animal this massive even biologically possible? If you were to scale an elephant up to the size of a Brachiosaurus, its bones would shatter under its own weight, its lungs would fail to provide enough oxygen, and its body heat would cook its internal organs. The secret to the dinosaurs' massive size lies in the evolutionary gifts they inherited from their ancient Triassic ancestors. First, they have that highly efficient, unidirectional respiratory system. While mammals like us breathe in and out, mixing fresh air with stale air, the dinosaurs breathe in a continuous one-way loop. But the sauropods take this a step further. Their bodies are filled with a complex network of air sacs that extend from their lungs into their very bones. These air sacs act like an internal cooling system, venting the massive amount of heat generated by their colossal bodies. But they also make the animal incredibly light. The vertebrae of sauropod are not solid blocks of bone like a mammal spine. They are hollowed out, structured with delicate, interlacing struts of bone called pleurocoels, making them as light and strong as a modern bridge truss. A sauropod might be the size of a building, but it is built like a bird, and they have one more massive advantage. Mammals have to chew their food. Chewing requires a massive, heavy skull, huge jaw muscles, and heavy teeth. A heavy head cannot be supported on the end of a long neck. The sauropods do not chew. They have tiny, lightweight heads at the end of impossibly long necks, sweeping through the trees like giant biological cranes. They use simple, peg-like teeth to rake leaves off the branches, and they swallow the vegetation completely whole. The actual mechanical breakdown of food happens deep inside their massive barrel-like stomachs, where they swallow smooth stones called gastroliths to grind the leaves into a paste. Because they don't chew, they don't need a heavy skull. Because they have a light skull, they can grow a 30-foot neck. Because they have a 30-foot neck, they can stand in one place and consume an entire grove of trees without expending the energy to move their 70-ton bodies. It is a masterpiece of energy efficiency. While the sauropods browse the canopy, the forest floor is patrolled by the apex predators of the Jurassic. Theropods like Allosaurus, a 30-foot-long, bipedal carnivore with dagger-like teeth and grasping claws. Allosaurus is not a mindless monster. It is a highly active, warm-blooded, highly intelligent hunter, capable of taking down the massive herbivores that share its world. For tens of millions of years, the Jurassic ecosystem operates in a state of majestic, gargantuan equilibrium. But as the clock ticks forward, crossing into the Cretaceous period around 145 million years ago, the botanical world undergoes a revolution that will fundamentally change the course of life on Earth. For 4 billion years, the planet has been green, brown, and blue. There has never been a splash of red, a streak of yellow, or a burst of purple. The plants reproduce by scattering spores or dropping cones into the wind. It is a slow, inefficient, and visually dull process. But deep in the early Cretaceous, a random mutation in a seed fern produces something totally unprecedented. Leaves mutate and curl inward to protect the seed. Other leaves modify their pigments, transforming into bright, vibrant colors designed to stand out against the green background. It is the invention of the flower. The angiosperms, the flowering plants, do not rely on the random, chaotic wind to carry their pollen. They invent a system of biological bribery. By producing bright colors and sweet, sugary nectar, they actively recruit animals to do the work for them. The appearance of the flower triggers an absolute explosion of coevolution. The insects, which have been steadily buzzing along since the Carboniferous, suddenly find a brand new, high-energy food source. Wasps mutate to become entirely dependent on pollen, covering themselves in fuzzy hairs to carry as much of it as possible. The bee is born. Butterflies and moths evolve long, delicate proboscises to drink the nectar from the deepest blossoms. Ants form massive, complex, subterranean societies to harvest the seeds. The world bursts into color, and the dinosaurs are forced to adapt to this rapidly changing, hyperproductive new ecosystem. As the flowering plants take over, the giant, towering conifer forests are slowly pushed back. The world becomes dominated by lower-growing, fast-recovering, highly nutritious flowering shrubs and early grasslands. The towering sauropods, built to eat the high canopy, slowly begin to decline in the northern hemisphere. In their place rises a new breed of dinosaur, specifically engineered to exploit this new floral bounty. These are the chewing dinosaurs. The ceratopsians, like Triceratops, with their massive, frilled skulls, parrot-like beaks, and incredibly complex dental batteries containing hundreds of teeth perfectly designed to shear through tough vegetation. And the hadrosaurs, the duck-billed dinosaurs, who travel in massive herds of thousands, grazing across the Cretaceous floodplains just like modern wildebeest or bison. To hunt these highly advanced, heavily armored, and socially complex herbivores, the predators must also evolve. The theropod dinosaurs bulk up, their skulls become deeper, their jaws thicker, and as the Cretaceous period reaches its final chapters, This evolutionary arms race produces what is arguably the most perfect, terrifying, and awe-inspiring terrestrial predator the universe has ever created. Tyrannosaurus rex. T-Rex is not just a big lizard. It is the absolute pinnacle of carnivorous biomechanics. 40 feet long, weighing up to 9 tons, it is the size of a city bus. But it is not a slow, lumbering scavenger. If you look at the skull of a T-Rex, you can see the absolute brilliance of its design. The eyes are not positioned on the sides of its head like most dinosaurs. They face directly forward, giving T-Rex binocular vision and depth perception that rivals a modern hawk. Its brain cavity reveals massive olfactory bulbs, giving it a sense of smell so acute it could track prey for miles in the dense Cretaceous forests. But its true weapon is its bite. The jaw muscles of a T-Rex are so massive they actually change the shape of its skull, bulging out the sides of its head. While other meat-eating dinosaurs are thin, blade-like teeth designed to slice flesh, the teeth of a T-Rex are thick, serrated, solid bone-crushing spikes, some the size of bananas. When a T-Rex bites down, it generates a force of over 8,000 pounds per square inch. It does not just bite the flesh of a Triceratops. It bites straight through the solid bone, crushing the armor, the ribs, and the spine in a single, devastating impact. The late Cretaceous is a thriving, incredibly diverse and vibrant world. The skies are filled with pterosaurs, flying reptiles with wingspans the size of small airplanes. The oceans are ruled by massive marine reptiles, mosacers and plesiosaurs, hunting in the shallow seas. The continents, now broken into familiar shapes resembling the modern globe, are ruled completely and unquestionably by the dinosaurs. They have survived for 165 million years. They have weathered shifting continents, changing climates, and shifting food webs. They are the most successful terrestrial dynasty in the history of the planet, and they have absolutely no idea that Tuesday is the end of the world. 66 million years ago, in the cold, silent vacuum of deep space, a piece of rock roughly 6 miles across is hurtling toward the Earth at 45,000 miles per hour. It is a carbonaceous chondrite asteroid, a leftover fragment from the very formation of the solar system. It has been traveling through the dark for billions of years, and its trajectory is perfectly, mathematically aligned with shallow, tropical sea in what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. The dinosaurs looking up into the morning sky do not see a fiery meteor. The asteroid is moving so fast that it outpaces the very sound of its own entry. It punches through the atmosphere in a fraction of a second, compressing the air in front of it so violently that the air itself turns into superheated plasma, glowing 10 times brighter than the sun. When the 6-mile-wide rock strikes the shallow ocean, it does not just hit the water. It vaporizes the water instantly and slams directly into the crust of the Earth. The energy released in that single fraction of a second is equivalent to 100 million megatons of TNT. It is more than 1 billion times more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. The impact created a crater over 90 miles wide and 12 miles deep, instantly vaporizing the rock of the Earth's crust and turning it into a massive plume of superheated, radioactive plasma that shoots straight up to the atmosphere and out into the vacuum of space. But the initial explosion is just the first localized nightmare. The impact triggers earthquakes that shatter the Richter scale, ringing the entire planet like a bell. The shockwave travels through the bedrock, triggering massive volcanic eruptions halfway across the globe. The shallow sea that was struck is instantly violently displaced, creating a tsunami hundreds of feet high that races outward, tearing across the coastlines and washing miles inland, dragging entire forests, herds of dinosaurs, and pulverized rock back into the boiling ocean. But the true apocalypse comes from above. The billions of tons of vaporized crust that were blasted into space cool and condense into tiny, glass-like spheres called tektites. Trillions upon trillions of these flaming glass beads are pulled back into the Earth's gravity, re-entering the atmosphere all over the globe at the exact same time. As they fall through the air, friction superheats them. The entire sky of the Earth turns into a solid canopy of glowing red heat. For several agonizing hours, the ambient temperature on the surface of the planet spikes to over 400 degrees Fahrenheit. The atmosphere literally becomes an oven. Every single dinosaur that is not deep underground or underwater is instantly roasted alive. The intense, radiating heat spontaneously ignites the world's forests. The entire planet catches fire simultaneously. When the fiery rain finally stops and the global firestorms burn themselves down to ash, the ultimate killer arrives. The impact through unimaginable quantities of pulverized rock, soot, and vaporized sulfur into the upper stratosphere. This thick, choking blanket wraps around the globe, completely blocking out the sun. The Earth is plunged into total, freezing darkness. The impact winter has begun. Without sunlight, the plants cannot photosynthesize. Within weeks, the surviving forests die and rot. Without the plants, the surviving giant herbivores starve to death. Without the giant herbivores, the surviving meat-eating dinosaurs starve to death. The food web, which had operated flawlessly for 165 million years, is completely and permanently snapped. In the freezing dark, surrounded by the rotting corpses of the great dinosaurs, 75% of all life on Earth is eradicated. Every single non-avian dinosaur, every pterosaur in the sky, and every giant marine reptile in the ocean goes extinct. The age of the reptilian titans is over. But deep underground, buried beneath the ash and the snow, something small, furry, and terrified is trembling in the dark. For 160 million years, our ancestors, the mammals, had been oppressed. After the Great Dying, when the archosaurs and the dinosaurs took over the world, the surviving synapsids were forced into the shadows. To survive the reign of the dinosaurs, they had to shrink. They became tiny, nocturnal creatures, no bigger than rats or shrews. To hunt in the cold dark, they evolved warm-bloodedness, generating their own internal heat. To stay warm, they evolved fur. To care for their helpless young, they evolved the ability to produce milk. And because they were hunting tiny insects in the dead of night, they had to rely on hearing and smell rather than vision, leading to a massive expansion of the neocortex, the thinking, processing part of the brain. For 160 million years, the mammals were the terrified underdogs of planet Earth, hiding from the footsteps of the T-Rex. But now the T-Rex is dead. The sun is blocked out. The world is freezing dark and filled with rotting meat and dead insects. For a giant cold-blooded reptile, this world is an unlivable hell. But for a tiny, warm-blooded, burrowing, insect-eating mammal, this world is a buffet. The mammals survive the asteroid because they are small, because they can regulate their own temperature, and because they can eat the insects that feed on the rotting dead. They wait out the dark years underground. And when the ash finally begins to settle, when the clouds part and the sunlight touches the surface of the Earth for the first time in a decade, the tiny mammals emerge in their burrows and blink into the light. The calendar turns to 66 million years ago. The Cenozoic era, the age of mammals, begins. With the dinosaurs gone, the mammals stare out at an empty, shattered world, just as the dinosaurs had done after the Triassic extinction, and just as the amphibians had done after the Devonian. And just like their predecessors, the mammals rapidly, aggressively explode into the evolutionary void. Within a few million years, the tiny, rat-like survivors mutate and diversify into an astonishing array of forms. Because they are warm-blooded and possess highly complex, adaptable teeth, they can exploit almost every ecological niche on the planet. Some mammals take to the open plains, elongating their legs, growing hooves, and become the fast-running ancestors of horses, deer, and antelope. Some mammals look to the skies, stretching the skin between their fingers to become bats, conquering the night air. Some mammals, looking for food in the shallow coastal waters, begin to spend more and more time swimming. Over millions of years, they lose their hind legs entirely. Their front legs turn into flippers, and they move permanently back into the ocean, becoming the whales and the dolphins, the largest animals to ever exist on Earth, larger even than the mighty sauropods. And some mammals retreat into the safety of the surviving tropical rainforests. They develop grasping hands with opposable thumbs to hold onto branches. They move their eyes to the front of their heads for binocular vision, allowing them to judge the distance between trees. They are the primates, our direct ancestors. For tens of millions of years, the world is a mammalian paradise. Giant sloths the size of elephants roam the Americas. Saber-toothed cats hunt massive, woolly mammoths across the frozen steppes. The Earth goes through cycles of intense heat and brutal ice ages, but the warm-blooded mammals adapt. growing thick coats of fur and migrating across the shifting continents. But the final chapter of our story begins much closer to home, driven once again by the restless, shifting tectonic plates of the Earth. Roughly 7 million years ago, the African continent is undergoing a massive geological change. The eastern edge of the continent is pulling apart, creating the Great Rift Valley. This tectonic shift disrupts the weather patterns that bring rain from the Atlantic. The lush, dense, unbroken jungle that covers Africa begins to dry out. The dense forest shatters into a patchwork mosaic of shrinking woods separated by vast, open expanses of tall grass. The savanna is born. For the apes living in the trees, this is a crisis. Their food sources are shrinking, and the trees are getting further and further apart. To survive, some of these apes are forced to climb down from the safety of the canopy and cross the dangerous, open tall grass to reach the next grove of trees. In the tall grass, a primate walking on all fours is blind. They cannot see over the stalks to spot the terrifying, big cats that hunt on the savanna. To survive the crossing, these apes are forced to stand up. Bipedalism, walking on two legs, is a defining spark of the human lineage. It is an incredibly awkward, energetically demanding way to move, and it wreaks havoc on the spine and the pelvis. But the evolutionary benefits are completely game-changing. Standing upright allows the early hominins, creatures like Australopithecus, to see over the grass. It exposes less of their body surface to the scorching African sun, helping them stay cool. But most importantly, it does something that no other evolutionary adaptation had ever done before. It completely frees the hands. For 500 million years, the front limbs of vertebrates have been used for swimming, running, flying, or digging. But an upright ape no longer needs its hands to walk. The hands are completely liberated to interact with the world. With free hands, an ape can carry food back to its family. With free hands, an ape can pick up a heavy rock and throw at a predator to defend itself. And eventually, roughly 2.5 million years ago, an ape realizes that if it smashes two rocks together, it can create a sharp edge. The invention of the stone tool by Homo habilis is the first moment that biology is bypassed by technology. A hominin does not need to wait 1 million years to evolve sharp teeth or heavy claws. It can simply manufacture them in an afternoon. Armed with sharp stones, these early humans can slice the meat off a scavenged carcass, accessing rich, dense calories that were previously locked away behind tough hides. And as they scavenge, they make the greatest discovery in the history of the animal kingdom. They discover fire. Homo erectus, stepping out onto the African plains, learns to capture, sustain, and eventually create flame. Fire is the ultimate weapon. It keeps the predators away in the dark night. It provides warmth in the freezing cold. But its true power lies in the way it changes food. Cooking meat and starchy tubers breaks down the tough proteins and complex carbohydrates before they even enter the body. It is essentially external digestion. Suddenly, the human digestive tract does not have to work nearly as hard. The intestines shrink, saving massive amounts of biological energy. And the human body takes all that newly freed energy, all of those rich cooked calories, and funnels them directly into a single, terrifyingly hungry organ, the brain. Over the next 2 million years, the hominin brain undergoes an explosive, unprecedented expansion. It doubles and then triples in size. The neocortex swells, pushing the forehead outward, creating the flat, vertical face of modern humans. This massive brain is not just a larger computer. It is a fundamentally different kind of processing engine. It is capable of abstract thought. It is capable of looking at a rock and imagining the spearhead hidden inside it. It is capable of looking at the stars and recognizing patterns. And most powerfully, it is capable of complex, symbolic language. Humans do not just communicate danger or the location of food. We can communicate concepts that do not exist in the physical world. We can tell stories. We can share knowledge across generations, meaning that a human child does not have to relearn everything from scratch. They can stand on the shoulders of the ancestors who came before them. Language creates culture. Culture creates cooperation on a scale never before seen in nature. A single human is a slow, weak, furless ape, easily killed by a leopard or a bear. But 50 humans, armed with spears, communicating with complex language, sharing a unified belief system, and wielding fire, are the most devastating apex predators the planet has ever produced. Roughly 300,000 years ago, Homo sapiens emerges. We spread out of Africa, crossing the deserts of the Middle East, walking along the frozen coast of Europe, pushing deep into the jungles of Asia, and eventually crossing the ice bridges into the Americas. We adapt to every single environment on Earth, not by waiting for our bodies to evolve, but by inventing clothes, building shelters, and domesticating the plants and animals around us. We invent agriculture, settling down in the fertile river valleys, allowing our populations to explode. We build villages, which become towns, which become massive, sprawling cities. We invent writing, locking our knowledge into stone, clay, and paper, creating an immortal external memory. We master the metals hidden in the earth. We harness the power of the wind and the rivers. We dig up the fossilized, unrotting forests of the Carboniferous period and burn them to power a global industrial revolution. We conquer the skies not by growing wings, but by building machines of aluminum and steel. We split the atom. We cure diseases. We launch ourselves off the very surface of the planet, standing on the silent, gray dust of the moon, looking back at the brilliant blue marble hanging in the endless dark of space. But as we sit in our climate-controlled rooms, surrounded by screens and concrete, insulated from the brutal, wild world of our ancestors, it is easy to forget what we truly are. Look down at your own body. You are not separated from the deep, chaotic history of the planet. You are the absolute sum of it. Run your hand along your back and feel the hard, bony ridges of your spine. That is the evolutionary echo of Pikaia, the tiny, translucent ribbons swimming to the terrifying monsters of the Cambrian Explosion. That simple, flexible notochord was passed down through 500 million years, hardening into bone, allowing you to stand upright today. Clench your jaw. Feel the hinge where your mandible meets your skull. You are using the exact same mechanical architecture that accidentally mutated from the gill arches of a jawless, mud-sucking fish in the ancient oceans of the Devonian. That accidental hinge allowed your ancestors to bite, to fight, and to survive the armored horrors of the deep. Look at your arm. 1 bone, 2 bones, a cluster of tiny bones in your wrist, the fingers tapping against a keyboard. You are wielding the exact same anatomical blueprint that Tiktaalik used to heave its heavy, scaly body out of a drying, stagnant puddle 375 million years ago. Your hands are the repurposed, modified fins of an ancient, desperate lobe-fin fish. Take a deep breath. Feel your ribs expand and your lungs fill with the rich, invisible atmosphere of the earth. You are using the same biological trick that allowed those ancient fish to gulp the air when the water turned toxic. And you are breathing an atmosphere that was terraformed by the creeping, primitive mosses and towering fungal spires that first conquered the dead, rocky continents. Feel the warmth of your own skin. That internal, self-regulating furnace was forged in the freezing, terrifying dark of the Triassic nights, when our tiny, shrew-like mammalian ancestors were hiding from the thundering footsteps of the dinosaurs. Your warm blood, your hair, and your incredibly complex, milk-producing biology are the scars of 160 million years of brutal nocturnal oppression. And finally, consider the brain inside your skull, the very organ that is interpreting these words, visualizing these ancient monsters, and comprehending the vast, terrifying abyss of deep time. That brain is the product of an unbroken chain of survivors. For 4 billion years, the Earth has tried to sterilize itself. It is frozen over into a solid snowball. It is burned in runaway greenhouse fires. It has poisoned the oceans with hydrogen sulfide gas. It has been bombarded by cosmic radiation, and it has been slammed by mountains of rock falling from deep space. Every single time, the great, ruling dynasties of the planet have been annihilated. The microbial mats were churned under. The armored trilobites were suffocated. The giant, bus-sized placoderms were frozen. The eagle-sized insects were choked. The galloping crocodiles were burned. The towering, majestic dinosaurs were obliterated in fire and darkness. But every single time the world ended, one of your ancestors found a way to survive. A fish that learned to crawl. A reptile that learned to regulate its temperature. A mammal that learned to hide underground. An ape that learned to stand up. If any one of those ancestors, stretching back millions of generations, had been slightly slower, slightly weaker, or slightly unluckier, the unbroken chain would have snapped. You are the product of 541 million years of unimaginable luck, desperate survival, and relentless, unstoppable biological creativity. You are not just a resident of Earth. You are the Earth. You are the stardust that cooled into rock, the rock that dissolved into the oceans, the chemistry that learned to replicate, the slime that learned to see, the fish that learned to walk, the mammal that learned to think, and a universe that finally woke up and learned to understand itself. The story of life on Earth is the story of you, and the journey is far from over. Thank you for joining us on this massive, unbroken journey through deep time. If you want to continue exploring the incredible history, biology, and mysteries of our planet, make sure to like this video. Leave a comment below about which ancient era blew your mind the most, and please consider subscribing to Earth's documentary. The story of our world is still being written, and we want you here for the next chapter. Until next time, keep looking down at the fossils, and keep looking up at the stars.